The dust was thick enough to taste. Margaret Holloway knew that taste: grit and iron, and the faint sour tang of hope running dry. She had been tasting it for 3 days now, ever since the wheel started its slow, grinding protest just outside of Glenwood Springs. She had wrapped it in wire and rope herself, using a scrap of leather for a glove because the sun had been high and the metal hot enough to brand. Her hands still ached from the work. The children had watched from the shade of a cottonwood, silent, as they always were when the situation pressed in close. Caleb, the oldest, had offered to help, and she had let him hold the rope steady while she tied the knot. He had not complained about the blisters forming on his own palms. He had not complained about anything since his father died. The wagon lurched again, and the gray mare, a creature of bone and patience, whose name, if she had ever had one, was long forgotten, stumbled and caught herself without breaking stride. Margaret did not look back at the children. She did not need to. She knew what she would see: Caleb's jaw set tight, Lucy's eyes fixed forward with that peculiar intensity she had inherited from her father, and little Thomas, pressed against Margaret's back with his wooden horse clutched to his chest, his breath coming in shallow, even puffs against her shoulder blade. They had been on the road for 3 weeks, and in that time the only thing that had not broken was the children's silence. It was a silence that scared her more than the broken wheel, more than the empty meal pouch, more than the approaching snow that would seal the passes within a month, because it meant they had stopped believing that anything good was coming. Before we go any further into Margaret's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me what city you're watching from today. Because what Margaret Holloway was about to do took more courage than any gunfight, and I want to make sure you are here for every step of it. She had seen the notice a week ago, nailed to the post outside the general store in a town whose name she had already forgotten. It was written on a piece of yellowed paper in a hand that was careful and unadorned, the handwriting of a man who did not waste ink on flourishes. Cook wanted. Live-in position. Meals 3 times daily. Kitchen kept clean. Wages paid monthly. No conversation required beyond what pertains to the work. She had read it twice, then unhooked the mare from the wagon, walked past the storekeeper's suspicious gaze, and made the decision that she would go there whether the man wanted her or not. She had no other choices left. The lane turned off the main road and cut through a stretch of grassland that was beginning to brown at the tips. The fence on either side was straight and well maintained, and the gate at the entrance was hung true on its hinges. That told her something about the man who owned this place. He took care of what was his. She hoped that care would extend to what was not yet his. The house came into view around a bend, a 2-story frame structure with a porch that ran the length of the front, painted white once but now weathered to a soft gray. The barn behind it was larger than the house, and the corrals were full of good horses. A man with a back that could still manage a saddle, a man who had been alone long enough to forget what a family looked like. He was standing in the yard when she pulled up, a tall man, lean in the way of men who work every day, with a face that had been carved by wind and solitude into something hard but not cruel. He wore a plain hat and a canvas coat, and his hands were in his pockets as he watched her approach. He did not move to help her down. He did not speak until the wagon had stopped and the dust had settled. "You lost?" he said. Margaret did not flinch. "I'm looking for Silas Greer." "You found him." She held the reins steady and looked him in the eye. "You posted a notice for a cook." He glanced at the wagon, at the children. His gaze lingered on the broken wheel, then on the mare's ribs. "Notice said 1 cook. Didn't say anything about a family." "They come with me," she said, "or I don't come at all." Silas Greer took his hands out of his pockets and crossed his arms. He studied her for a long moment, and Margaret realized he was not looking at her the way men usually looked at widows. Not with pity, not with calculation, but with something closer to what she had seen in her own husband's eyes when he was trying to solve a problem that had no obvious solution. "I don't need a schoolroom," he said. "They're not scholars. They work." "The oldest?" "Caleb, 13. He can handle a hammer and a rope." "The girl?" "Lucy, 9. She's sharp, reads better than most grown men, keeps accounts." "The little one?" "Thomas, he's 4. He's quiet." Silas looked at Thomas, who had turned his head just enough to peer around his mother's arm, holding up his wooden horse as if it were a shield. Something flickered in the rancher's face, a crack in the stone, there and gone. "What about the husband?" he said. "Dead, 3 years, fever. You been managing alone since?" "I have." He nodded slowly, as if she had given him the password he was waiting for. Then he turned and walked toward the house without looking back. Margaret did not move. She waited. At the porch step he stopped. "Well?" he said. "You coming or not?" She let out a breath she had been holding since the lane and climbed down from the bench. Caleb was already on the ground, reaching up to take Thomas. Lucy jumped down on her own, landing light as a cat, her eyes taking in everything, the house, the barn, the man, the horse. She was already writing it down somewhere in that head of hers. Margaret knew that look. It was the same look her husband had worn when he was figuring out a new piece of furniture. The room off the kitchen was no bigger than a closet. A single cot against the wall, a washstand with a cracked basin, a window that looked out toward the fence line. The floor was clean but bare, raw plank, swept but never scrubbed. Margaret stood in the doorway and felt the weight of 3 years pressed down on her shoulders. This was the place. This was where she would either break or bend. She bent. "It'll do," she said. Silas was behind her, holding a folded canvas tarp. "There's a storage shed with another cot, for the boy. That's not necessary. It's no trouble." She turned and looked at him. He was not meeting her eyes, but he was not looking away either. He was looking at the corner of the room where the cot would go, as if he were already measuring the space in his mind. "Then we'd be grateful," she said. He nodded and left, and she heard his boots cross the kitchen and the back door open and close. She sat down on the cot and put her head in her hands. The children stood in the doorway, waiting for her to tell them what to do next. "Caleb," she said, her voice steady, "take the mare to the trough. Make sure she gets enough water before you tie her. Lucy, find the meal sack in the wagon and bring it inside. Thomas, stay with me." They moved without hesitation, and Margaret sat alone in the small room and let herself feel the thin edge of something that might have been relief if she had dared to call it that. Supper that first evening was a simple affair. Salt pork, beans, and a small loaf of cornbread she had baked the night before and wrapped in cloth to keep warm. She set Silas's place at the head of the table, and the children's at the far end, as if there were a line drawn in the wood between them. He came in at 6 o'clock sharp, took off his hat, and sat down without a word. She served him first, and he ate without looking up. The children ate in silence, too, but their silence was different, the kind of quiet that comes from being too hungry to talk. Halfway through the meal, Thomas dropped his spoon. It clattered against the floor, and Margaret reached to pick it up, but Silas was faster. He bent down, retrieved the spoon, and handed it back to the boy. Thomas took it with both hands and said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer." Silas paused. He looked at the boy, at the wooden horse propped on the bench beside him, at the small face that held no fear, only curiosity. "You're welcome," he said. It was the first time Margaret heard him say those words. She did not know then how many more times he would say them before the winter was done. After supper, Silas went to the front room and sat in a chair by the window, reading a newspaper that was 3 weeks old. Margaret washed the dishes, and Caleb dried them with a rag that had been worn thin by years of use. Lucy sat in the corner with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper, drawing something that looked like a horse but could have been a dog. Thomas sat on the floor beside his mother, playing with the wooden horse, making soft sounds under his breath. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked, and for the first time in 3 years, the house felt like it was breathing. Margaret went to bed that night in the small room, with Thomas curled against her side and Lucy on the floor beside the cot on a pallet of old blankets. Caleb had taken the second cot in the kitchen, near the fire, because he was too old to share a room with his mother and sisters. She had not told him that, but he had understood without being told. That was the way it was with Caleb. He understood things that no 13-year-old should have to understand. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. The creak of the floorboards as Silas moved in the front room, the scrape of his chair being pushed back, the sound of his boots crossing to the stairs, the soft click of a door closing. And then, silence. Not the heavy, empty silence of the open road, but the full silence of a house that contained other beating hearts. She closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep, and for the first time in weeks, she did not dream of the wagon breaking down. In the morning, she was up before dawn. She had not been told how early the man expected breakfast, but she had learned to read a household by its light and its sounds. Silas Greer was a creature of habit. She could tell by the way he had laid his boots side by the door, the way he had hung his hat on the same peg, the way he had banked the fire with the exact same pattern of ash and ember. She rebuilt the fire, put coffee on, and started mixing dough for biscuits before the first gray light touched the window. He came down at exactly 5:30, and she had the coffee ready and the biscuits in the oven. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She did not look up from the stove. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He poured his coffee and stood by the window, drinking it in silence. She worked in silence. The biscuits came out golden and steaming, and she set one on his plate. He took it, bit into it, and stopped. For a moment he just stood there, chewing. "Good biscuit," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Greer." He ate 3 more, drank 2 cups of coffee, and then put on his hat and went out to the barn. Margaret watched him go through the window, walking straight-backed into the cold morning, and she thought about how a man could go years without hearing the words "thank you" or "good biscuit" and never realize he was starving for them. The first week passed like this: work, meals, silence, small courtesies lodged between the gaps. Caleb started following Silas to the barn without being asked. Lucy found a broken saddle in the shed and spent 3 days taking it apart and putting it back together. Thomas spoke to his wooden horse as if it were a living thing, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he spoke to Silas's shadow. On the 6th day, the trouble came. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw a rider coming up the lane. He was not Silas. This man was shorter, wider, with a face that had been softened by too many good meals and too little honest work. He reined in at the gate and looked at her with the kind of smile that made her want to hold Thomas a little closer. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "I'm looking for Silas Greer. He's out on the north pasture. You his new cook?" The way he said it, cook, had a sheen to it, like he was tasting the word and finding it not quite to his liking. "I am. Heard he took on a widow and 3 children. That true?" Margaret did not answer. She picked up the basket of laundry and started toward the house. "I'll wait," the man called after her. She did not turn around. Silas came back an hour later. She saw him ride in from the porch, saw the rider dismount and walk toward him with that same smile. The conversation was short. She could not hear the words, but she watched the set of Silas's shoulders, the way his hand rested on his belt, the way he did not once take his eyes off the man's face. The rider got back on his horse and left, and Silas stood in the yard until the dust settled. When he came inside, his face was unreadable. "Who was that?" she asked. "Name's Collar. Owns the spread to the north. He's been trying to buy this land for 7 years. What did he want?" Silas sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands for a long moment before he answered. "He came to tell me that a widow with 3 children is bad for property value, that I should consider letting you go before the ground freezes." Margaret's heart stopped. Then it started again, colder. "He has no right to tell you how to run your ranch." "No," Silas said, "he doesn't. But he's a patient man, and he's a rich man, and he's been waiting for me to make a mistake." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that was not stone. It was fear. "I'm not a mistake," she said. "No," he said, "you're not." He got up and went back outside. Margaret stood in the kitchen with the laundry basket still in her hands, and she understood that the trouble had not just arrived. It had been waiting for her, coiled in the dust of the lane, patient as a rattlesnake. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat by the fire in the front room and wrote a letter to her husband's brother, Thomas Harding. She had not written to him in 3 years, not since he had sent a letter offering to take the children after James died, an offer that came with so many conditions and stipulations that she had burned it in the hearth without a second thought. But now she wrote to him, telling him where she was, what she was doing, that the children were well. She did not know why she wrote it. She did not mail it. She folded it and tucked it into her apron pocket and told herself it was just in case. In the morning, she burned it with the morning fire, and she did not mention Collar's visit to the children. She did not need to. Caleb had been at the fence post when Collar rode in, and he had seen the look on the man's face. He had seen everything. He had his father's eyes for that. On the 9th day, Thomas fell off the porch and broke his arm. It happened fast. Margaret was in the garden, pulling the last of the carrots before the frost took them. Thomas was on the porch, playing with his horse, and then he was on the ground, crying in a way that was too sharp and too thin to be a tantrum. She ran. Silas was out of the barn before she reached the boy, scooping him up in his arms, feeling the bone through the skin with careful, calloused fingers. "It's broken," he said. "I know," she said, her voice tight. "We need to set it. I can do it. I've done it before." She looked at him. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. She nodded. The doctor was 2 hours away. There was no time. Silas carried Thomas into the kitchen and laid him on the table. Lucy stood in the doorway, her face white, her hands pressed against her mouth. Caleb came in from the barn and took her shoulders and pulled her away, and Margaret heard him say, "Stay with me, Luce. Don't watch." Margaret held Thomas's hand while Silas worked. The boy screamed, but only once. Then he bit his lip and went quiet, the way children learn to go quiet when there is no one to tell them it's all right to cry. Silas set the bone and wrapped it in strips of cloth torn from an old sheet, and when he was done, he tied the sling and stepped back. "You did good, Thomas," he said. Thomas looked up at him, his eyes swimming, his lip trembling. "Can I keep my horse?" Silas glanced at the wooden horse, which had fallen off the table and was lying on the floor. He picked it up and tucked it into the sling beside the boy's chest. "Yes," he said, "he'll stay with you." Thomas closed his eyes and fell asleep, exhausted, his good hand resting on the horse. Margaret stood by the table and watched Silas wash the blood off his hands in the basin. His back was to her, but she saw the way his shoulders shook once, just once, before he stilled them. "Thank you," she said. "He's a brave boy," Silas said. He did not turn around. "He's been through a lot." "I know." She crossed the room and stood beside him. He did not look at her. "Silas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name. He turned. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said, "I did." She did not know what he meant by that. She did not ask. But she stood there in the quiet kitchen with the fire crackling and the boy sleeping on the table, and she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the lane had brought her to a place where a broken wheel was not the end of the road, but the beginning of something else. Outside, the wind picked up, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Winter was coming, and Silas Greer, who had burned a notice to a fire pit 3 weeks ago and told himself he needed no one, stood in his kitchen with a broken boy in his care and a woman beside him, and he did not know what came next. But for the first time in 6 years, he was afraid of losing it. And that, more than anything else, told him he had already lost the fight against caring. The snow fell for 3 days straight. Not the gentle kind that dusts the ground and melts by noon, but the heavy, wet kind that bends the branches of the cottonwoods and turns the lane into a sea of mud that freezes overnight into ruts that could snap a wagon wheel. Silas Greer had seen winters like this before. He had weathered them alone, with nothing but the fire and the wind and the long, empty hours between dark and dawn. But this winter was different. This winter, there was a boy with a broken arm learning to split kindling with one hand, a girl who kept a ledger of every kindness shown to her, a 4-year-old who followed him to the barn every morning with a wooden horse tucked under his good arm, and a woman who filled the house with the smell of bread. On the 4th day, the sky cleared, and the cold settled in like a guest that had no intention of leaving. Silas woke before dawn, as he always did, and found the kitchen already warm. Abigail was at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. She had Thomas on her hip, his arm still in the sling, his face pressed against her shoulder. He was half asleep, but he had a grip on her dress that told Silas he had woken up scared and had not found the words yet to say why. "Morning," Silas said. "Morning." She did not turn around. "There's coffee." He poured himself a cup and stood by the window. The yard was white, unbroken, except for the tracks of a rabbit that had crossed near the barn. The fence posts wore caps of snow, and the roof of the barn sagged under the weight of it. He would have to shovel it off before the day was done, or the beams would start to groan. "Thomas is up early," he said. "He had a dream," Abigail said. "He doesn't want to talk about it." Silas looked at the boy. Thomas had turned his head and was watching him with one eye, the other still pressed against his mother's shoulder. The wooden horse was in his good hand, held up like a shield. "I had bad dreams when I was his age," Silas said. "Used to wake up and think there was something in the room with me." Thomas's eye widened. "What did you do?" the boy whispered. "I got a dog," Silas said. "Best cure for bad dreams there is." Thomas considered this. "I have a horse." "That's even better. A horse can see things a dog can't." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer. He tucked his horse against his chest and closed his eyes again. Abigail looked at Silas over the boy's head, and there was something in her face that he could not name, but it made him look away. Caleb came in from the bunk room he had taken over near the back door, stamping his boots on the mat. His cheeks were red from the cold, and he had a coil of rope over his shoulder that he had been working on by lamplight the night before. "Snow's deep," he said. "The gray mare is standing in it up to her knees. We should move the horses closer to the barn today." Silas nodded. "After breakfast." They ate at the table, the same arrangement they had kept since the first night. Silas at the head, the children at the far end, Abigail serving and then sitting at the corner, close enough to reach Thomas if he needed her. The silence was not uncomfortable anymore. It had become familiar, the way the creak of a floorboard in a certain spot becomes familiar. Lucy was the first to break it. "Mr. Greer," she said, "how many acres do you own?" Silas looked up from his oatmeal. 360. "That's a section." "It is." "How many head of cattle?" 43 now. Had 60 before the fever year." She wrote something down in her ledger, which she had brought to the table and laid open beside her bowl. "And how many horses?" 7. "Including the gray mare?" "Including her." She nodded and made another note. Silas watched her, the way her fingers moved, the way her eyes measured the page, as if she were drawing a map. "Why do you keep that book?" he asked. Lucy looked at him with the kind of seriousness that belongs to people who have seen things they should not have seen. "Because if you don't write things down, they get lost." "What things?" "Everything. The number of cattle, the day Thomas broke his arm, the first time it snowed." She paused. "The first time you said my brother did good work." Silas put down his spoon. He looked at Caleb, who was staring at his plate with a carefully neutral face. He looked at Thomas, who was drawing patterns in the oatmeal with his finger. He looked at Abigail, who was watching him with those steady, measuring eyes. "That's a good practice," he said. "Keeping records." Lucy nodded and went back to her breakfast. The conversation moved on, but the moment stayed with Silas for the rest of the day, sitting somewhere in his chest like a stone that was slowly warming. The afternoon brought a visitor. Silas was on the roof of the barn, shoveling snow, when he saw a buckboard coming up the lane. It was not Collar's buckboard. This one was smaller, older, pulled by a single bay horse that was blowing hard from the effort. The driver was a man in a black coat and a hat that had seen better days. He pulled up in front of the house and sat for a moment, looking around the yard the way a man looks when he is not sure he has the right address. Silas climbed down from the roof and walked over. The man saw him coming and stepped down from the buckboard, holding out a gloved hand. "Mr. Greer? Name's Hadley. Will Hadley. I'm an attorney over in Glenwood Springs." Silas shook his hand. "I know who you are. I've seen your name on the courthouse filings." "Then you know I'm not in the habit of making social calls. I came because I got a letter from a man named Thomas Harding. He's asking about the legal status of a widow named Abigail Harding and her 3 children." Silas's hand stopped halfway to his pocket. "What about them?" "He's claiming that as the only surviving male relative of the deceased husband, he has a right to petition for guardianship of the children. He says the widow is living in unstable conditions, no fixed residence, no steady income, no male protector." "She has a fixed residence," Silas said. "She has a steady income. She has a roof and heat and food." "I know that," Hadley said, "but Harding doesn't, or he chooses not to. He's filed a preliminary inquiry with the county court. They asked me to look into it since I'm the nearest officer of the court. I'm supposed to make a report." Silas stared at him. The wind picked up, lifting snow off the roof and scattering it across the yard. "What kind of report?" "The kind that says whether the children are in danger, whether the mother is fit, whether the household is suitable." "And what will you tell them?" Hadley looked at the house. Through the kitchen window the light was warm. He could see the shape of a woman moving inside. He looked at the barn, the fence, the stacked wood, the signs of a place that was being cared for. "I haven't decided yet," he said. "That's why I came in person, to see for myself." Silas felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You want to come inside?" "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Harding, if she's willing." Silas did not move. He stood between Hadley and the door and thought about the letter that Abigail had burned in the fire. He thought about the brother-in-law who had not come to the funeral, who had not helped when the fever took James, who had waited 3 years and then decided he wanted what he had never earned. "She's a good mother," Silas said. "I'm sure she is. Those children are well cared for." "I believe you." "Then why do you need to see her?" Hadley's face softened, just slightly. "Because the law doesn't run on belief, Mr. Greer. It runs on evidence, and I need to be able to write down what I see, not what I'm told." Silas held his gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Wait here, I'll get her." Abigail came to the door with Thomas on her hip. She had washed her hands and smoothed her apron, and her face was composed. But Silas saw the way her fingers tightened on the doorframe when he told her who had come. "I'll speak to him," she said. "You don't have to." "Yes," she said, "I do." She stepped out onto the porch, setting Thomas down and taking his hand. The boy looked at Hadley with the same wary expression he had worn when Silas first met him. Lucy appeared in the doorway behind them, her ledger clutched to her chest. Hadley took off his hat. "Mrs. Harding, I apologize for the intrusion." "You're here because of Thomas." "Yes, ma'am. He's filed a petition with the court. I'm required to investigate." "Investigate what? My ability to care for my children?" "Your circumstances, your residence, your means of support." "I have employment. I have a roof. My children are fed and clothed and healthy." "I can see that," Hadley said, "but I need to document it. Would you mind if I asked a few questions?" Abigail looked at Silas. He did not know what she saw in his face, but whatever it was, it made her straighten her shoulders and nod. She answered every question without hesitating. How long she had been here, what her duties were, what wages she received, where the children slept, what they ate, how they spent their days. She did not embellish. She did not apologize. She laid out the facts the way she had laid out the salt pork and beans on the first night, plain and sufficient. Hadley wrote it all down in a small notebook. When he was done, he closed it and tucked it into his coat pocket. "That's all for now," he said. "I'll file my report with the court. I don't expect any action will be taken." "But it could be," Abigail said. Hadley hesitated. "If Mr. Harding presses the matter, it could go before a judge. But based on what I've seen here, the court would be unlikely to remove children from a stable, employed mother." "Unlikely is not the same as impossible." "No, ma'am, it's not." He put his hat back on. "Mrs. Harding, if I may offer some advice, don't leave this place. Not until the matter is resolved. Stability is your strongest argument." Abigail nodded. She did not say thank you. She picked up Thomas and carried him back inside. Lucy followed, closing the door behind them. Silas walked Hadley to his buckboard. The attorney climbed up and gathered the reins. "She's got backbone," Hadley said. "Yes. Harding's got money and connections. That doesn't always win in court, but it makes the fight longer." "I figured." Hadley looked down at him. "You're not her husband." "No. But you stand to lose something if she goes." Silas did not answer. He did not have to. Hadley nodded once, as if he had heard the answer in the silence, and drove away. Silas stood in the yard long after the buckboard disappeared. The snow had started falling again, light and steady. He thought about the porch where Thomas had fallen, the kitchen table where Lucy wrote in her ledger, the room off the kitchen where Abigail slept with her children. He had built this house for himself, and it had never felt like a home. Now it did, and someone was trying to take it apart. He went inside. The kitchen was quiet. Abigail was sitting at the table, staring at the wall. Lucy was in the corner, writing. Thomas was on the floor, pushing his horse across the floorboards, making soft hoofbeat sounds with his mouth. Caleb was not there. Silas heard the sound of an axe from behind the barn. "He can't take them," Silas said. Abigail did not look at him. "He can try. Let him." She turned. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that Silas recognized. It was the same thing he had seen in his own face in the mirror after Eleanor left. It was the look of someone who has been through worse and is not afraid to go through it again. "You don't understand," she said. "Thomas Harding is not the kind of man who gives up. He will spend whatever it takes. He will hire whoever he needs. He will drag this through every court in the territory until he gets what he wants." "What does he want?" She paused. "I don't know. Maybe he wants to be seen as the good brother. Maybe he feels guilty for not being there when James died. Maybe he wants the children because he never had any of his own. But whatever it is, he believes he has a right to them. And men like that don't let go." Silas sat down across from her. "I have land. I have savings. I have a good lawyer in Hadley. I have a ranch that has survived worse. I'm not letting go either." She looked at him. The firelight caught her face, and for a moment she looked younger than she was, the way she must have looked before James died, before the weight of 3 years alone had carved lines into her skin. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much?" He had not expected the question. He searched for an answer that was honest but not too bare. "Because you showed up on a broken wheel and didn't ask for anything except what you were willing to earn. Because your boy fixed my gate before I got around to it. Because your daughter writes down everything I do like she's keeping accounts on my soul. Because your littlest one carries a horse around and talks to it like it's alive. And I find myself hoping that someday he'll talk to me that way too." He stopped. The words had come out rougher than he intended, and he could not call them back. Abigail did not move. She did not speak. She just looked at him, and the silence between them was full of things that had not been said, things that were pressing against the walls of the room, like the snow pressing against the windows. Then Thomas looked up from the floor and asked, "Mr. Greer, can you make a horse? Out of wood?" Silas cleared his throat. "I can try. Will you?" "Yes," he said. "I will." He got up and went to the barn. He found a piece of scrap pine in the corner and a carving knife that had not been used in years. He sat down on a crate and started to whittle. The work was slow and clumsy. He had not carved anything since he was a boy, but he kept at it, shaping the rough outline of a horse, feeling the wood take form under his hands. He was still at it when Caleb came in to feed the horses. The boy stopped when he saw Silas with the knife and the wood. "What's that?" "A horse." "For Thomas?" "Yes." Caleb set down the feed bucket and came closer. He watched for a while without speaking. Then he said, "My father used to carve, not horses, birds. He said birds were easier because you didn't have to get the legs right." Silas kept working. "Was he good at it?" "He was all right." Caleb paused. "He never finished anything, though. He'd get it half done and then get interested in something else. My mother used to say he had a good start on 100 things and a finish on none of them." Silas looked at the half-shaped block in his hands. "I intend to finish this one." Caleb nodded. He did not say anything else. He went back to feeding the horses, and Silas went back to carving, and the barn was quiet except for the sound of the knife against the wood and the soft breathing of the animals in the dark. When he went inside for supper, he had a crude shape that looked something like a horse. It was not beautiful. The legs were too thick, the neck too short, the head a lump that barely suggested a nose. But it was recognizable, and when he handed it to Thomas after the meal, the boy took it with both hands and held it up to the lamp. "It's a horse," he said. "It's a horse," Silas agreed. Thomas looked at the wooden horse he had been carrying for 3 years, the one his father had made before the fever, the one with the cracked ear and the missing tail. Then he looked at the new one. He put them side by side on the table. "This one's the mama," he said, touching the old horse. "And this one's the baby." He lined them up and moved them across the tablecloth like they were walking side by side. And Silas sat at the table and watched him, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would not break the moment. That night, after the children were in bed, Silas found Abigail in the kitchen, sitting alone with a cup of cold tea. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. She did not look at him when he came in. "He's going to come," she said. "Thomas. He won't just send a lawyer, he'll come himself." "Then I'll be here." "That's not enough." "It's what I've got." She set down the cup and turned to face him. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying. "I have been running for 3 years. From debt. From loneliness. From men who looked at me like I was something they could use. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and I found a place that felt safe. But safe doesn't last, Silas. It never does." He did not know what to say to that. He had spent so long convincing himself that safe was a thing you built by yourself that he had never learned how to promise it to someone else. "Maybe it doesn't last," he said, "but it can last longer than you think. I've been safe on this land for 6 years because I never let anyone close enough to change it. You changed it, you and those children, and I'm not sorry for that." She looked at him. The fire crackled. The wind rattled the window. "You should be careful what you promise," she said. "I'm not promising anything, I'm just saying what is." She stood up. She crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of him. She was close enough that he could smell the wood smoke in her hair, close enough that he could see the small lines around her eyes, the ones that came from worry and hard winters. "If Thomas comes," she said, "and if he tries to take my children, I will do whatever I have to do to stop him. I will leave here. I will go back on the road. I will disappear into the mountains if I have to. I will not let them be raised by a man who thinks they are a claim to be filed." "I know. And if I leave, you will not see any of us again." He understood what she was saying. She was giving him a chance to step back, to protect himself, to draw a line between his life and hers before it was too late. He did not step back. "Then I guess I'll have to make sure you don't have to leave." He went to bed after that. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Somewhere in the dark, Thomas cried out in his sleep, and he heard Abigail's voice, low and soothing, and then silent. He thought about the wooden horse he had carved. It was ugly, the legs were too thick, but Thomas had called it the baby, and he had walked it across the table next to the old horse, and that had been enough. That had been more than enough. He fell asleep with the image of that small hand moving the horse across the cloth, and he dreamed of snow, and of a lane, and of a wagon with a broken wheel that never stopped coming. In the morning he woke to the smell of biscuits and the sound of Lucy's voice reading aloud from her ledger. She was listing the supplies they would need before the passes closed completely. Flour, salt, coffee, sugar, oats for the horses, feed for the chickens that Abigail had somehow managed to acquire from a neighbor 3 miles south. Silas listened from his room, and he smiled. It was a small thing, unconscious, and he did not realize he was doing it until he caught his reflection in the window. He stopped smiling. He stared at himself, at the man who had burned a notice and told himself he needed no one, the man who had spent 6 years building walls and calling them peace, the man who had just carved a wooden horse for a child who was not his. He did not know what to call that, but he knew it was not something he could walk away from. He dressed and went down to breakfast. The kitchen was warm and full of light. Thomas was sitting on the floor, the 2 horses side by side in front of him. Lucy was at the table, her ledger open. Caleb was already outside, but Silas could see him through the window, breaking ice on the trough. Abigail set a plate in front of him. Biscuits, gravy, a slice of ham from a smokehouse that had been empty for years until she had filled it. "There's a letter," she said, setting an envelope beside his plate. "Came with the morning milk. The boy from the Hendersons brought it." He looked at the envelope. It was addressed to him, in a hand he did not recognize. He opened it and read it while the coffee cooled, and the children watched. It was from Thomas Harding. He had written to say that he would be arriving within the fortnight to discuss the children's situation in person. He expected Mr. Greer to cooperate with a full accounting of Mrs. Harding's employment and living conditions. He reminded Silas that interference with a legal guardianship proceeding was a serious matter. Silas read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket. "He's coming," he said. Abigail did not flinch. She had known. She had been waiting for it. "How long?" "Fortnight, maybe less." She nodded. She picked up Thomas and set him on her lap. The boy wrapped his good arm around her neck and held on. "Then we have 2 weeks," she said. Silas looked at the letter in his pocket. He looked at Lucy, who was watching him with those enormous, unblinking eyes. He looked at Thomas, who had picked up the baby horse and was pressing it against his mother's shoulder. He did not say anything. He finished his breakfast, put on his hat, and went out to the barn. There was work to do, and there was a man coming who would try to take everything that had become worth keeping. The 2 weeks passed like water through a sieve. Each morning, Silas woke to the gray light of another winter day and the knowledge that the time was shrinking, that every hour brought Thomas Harding closer to the lane. He did not say this aloud. He did not need to. The tension lived in the house like a presence, settling into the corners, making the children quieter than they had been, making Abigail's hands move a little faster when she worked. On the 3rd day after the letter arrived, Silas drove into Glenwood Springs to speak with Will Hadley in person. He left before dawn, riding the gray mare because she was steady and sure-footed in the snow, and he did not want to risk the wagon on roads that had not been cleared. The ride took 2 hours, the cold biting through his coat, the wind pushing against him like a hand trying to turn him back. Will Hadley's office was above the dry goods store, a small room with a single window that looked out over the main street. The lawyer was already at his desk when Silas arrived, a cup of coffee steaming beside him, a stack of papers in front of him. He did not look surprised to see Silas. "He's coming," Silas said. "I figured as much. Sit down." Silas sat. He told Hadley about the letter, about the 2-week deadline, about the threat that Harding carried with him like a loaded gun. Hadley listened without interrupting, his pen moving across a sheet of paper, making notes. "The court won't hear a guardianship petition until the new year at the earliest," Hadley said when Silas was done. "That gives us time. But Harding could try to remove the children by other means." "What other means?" "He could claim that Mrs. Harding is unfit and request a temporary placement pending the hearing. That's an emergency order. It's harder to get, but if he finds a sympathetic judge, it's possible." "How do we stop that?" Hadley set down his pen. "We prove that she's fit. We show that the children are safe, housed, fed, educated. We document every meal, every lesson, every night they sleep under a roof that is warm and dry." He paused. "And we show that she has a husband." Silas stared at him. "What?" "Not a real one," Hadley said. "A legally recognized one. If Mrs. Harding were married, the court would be far less likely to disturb the household. A husband provides legal standing. He has the right to claim the children as dependents. He can fight the guardianship petition as an interested party." Silas's mouth went dry. "You're saying I should marry her?" "I'm saying it would strengthen her case. It would make it harder for Harding to argue instability. And it would give you standing in the proceedings. Right now you're just an employer. That's a thin shield." Silas sat back in his chair. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. He thought about Abigail in the kitchen, about the way she held Henry when he woke from a nightmare, about the ledger Nell kept, about Samuel asking him questions about the land. He thought about the moment on the porch when he had told her he loved her, and she had said yes. "I already asked her," he said. Hadley's eyebrows went up. "And?" "She said yes." Hadley leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Then what are you waiting for?" "I don't know. I thought we had time. I wanted to do it right." "Time is what you don't have. Do it now, before Harding arrives. A wedding certificate signed by a judge or a preacher gives you a weapon he can't take away." Silas nodded slowly. He understood what Hadley was saying. It was not about romance. It was about armor. "I'll talk to her tonight," he said. He rode back to the ranch with the cold wind at his back and the plan forming in his mind. It was not the way he had imagined it, a rushed ceremony with a lawyer as witness and a judge reciting the words. But it was necessary. And necessity had a way of stripping away the frills and leaving only what mattered. When he told Abigail that evening, she did not argue. She listened, her hand still in a bowl of dough, her face unreadable. When he finished, she wiped her hands on her apron and sat down across from him. "You think this will work?" "Hadley thinks it will give us a fighting chance." "And what do you think?" He looked at her. The firelight caught the shadows under her eyes. the lines of exhaustion that had been there since the first day. But beneath them was something else, something steady and unbroken. "I think I was going to ask you anyway," he said. "This just moves the date forward." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "All right. Tomorrow?" "Day after. Hadley is getting the papers ready. Judge Morrison can see us at noon. Then we'd better tell the children." They gathered in the front room. Samuel stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his face cautious. Nell sat on the floor with her ledger, her pencil poised. Henry was on Silas's chair, his 2 wooden horses in his lap, watching everyone with wide eyes. Abigail spoke first. She told them that she and Mr. Greer were going to be married. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, and the room was silent for a moment, the words settling into the air like snow into the yard. Samuel was the first to speak. "Why?" "Because we want to," Abigail said. "That's not the only reason." Silas looked at the boy. Samuel's eyes were sharp, older than his years. He had heard something in the way his mother spoke. "No," Silas said, "it's not the only reason. Your uncle is coming. He wants to take you and your sisters away. If your mother is married, it makes it harder for him to do that." Samuel's jaw tightened. "So it's a legal thing." "It's a legal thing," Silas said, "but it's also a true thing. I asked your mother to marry me because I want her to stay. I want all of you to stay. The legal part just helps make sure that happens." Samuel looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his mother. She nodded. "All right," Samuel said. He did not smile. He did not seem happy. But he accepted it, which was more than Silas had expected. Nell had been writing furiously in her ledger. She looked up and said, "I'm going to record the date." "You do that," Silas said. Henry slid off the chair and walked over to Silas. He held up the baby horse, the one Silas had carved. "Will you still be Mr. Greer?" "I'll still be me," Silas said. "You can call me whatever you want." Henry thought about this. "I'll call you Mr. Greer." He went back to his chair and put the 2 horses side by side on the seat. The conversation was over. The day of the wedding was cold and bright. The sun came out for the first time in a week, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Abigail wore her best dress, the one with the mended sleeve, and she had braided Nell's hair and tucked Henry's shirt in and told Samuel to stand up straight. They rode into Glenwood in the wagon, the gray mare picking her way carefully over the frozen ruts. Judge Morrison's chambers were small and warm. The judge was an old man with white whiskers and a voice that carried the weight of 40 years on the bench. He read the words from a worn book, and Silas repeated them, and Abigail repeated them, and the children stood in a row behind them, watching. When it was done, the judge closed the book and shook Silas's hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Greer. I hope this union brings you peace." Silas looked at Abigail. She looked back at him, and there was something in her face that he had not seen before. A kind of opening, a softening, like a door that had been locked for years finally swinging inward. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. They ate dinner at the hotel dining room, a luxury that Silas had not planned for, but that seemed necessary, a marker of the day's importance. Henry mashed his potatoes into a mountain and ate them with his fingers, and Nell drew a picture of the ceremony on the back of the menu, and Samuel sat quietly but ate 3 helpings of roast beef. The waitress brought them a slice of apple pie in honor of the occasion, and Henry announced that it was the best day of his life, which made Nell roll her eyes and Abigail laugh. That full laugh that Silas had heard only twice before. They drove home in the late afternoon, the sun low and gold, the shadows long across the snow. The children fell asleep in the back of the wagon, wrapped in blankets, their heads resting on each other. Silas and Abigail sat on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For doing this, for not making it a thing to be talked about, for just doing what needed to be done." "I'm not good at talking," he said. "I know, that's what I'm thanking you for." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than the one they had started with. Fuller, warmer. The silence of 2 people who have agreed to carry the same weight. The next morning, Thomas Harding arrived. He came not in a hired coach, but in a private carriage, black and polished, pulled by a pair of matched bays. He sat alone inside, looking out the window with an expression of careful disapproval, as if the whole landscape had been arranged to inconvenience him. He stopped at the gate and did not get out. He waited for someone to come to him. Silas was in the barn. He saw the carriage through the open door, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. He put down the pitchfork and walked out into the yard. Harding lowered the window. "Mr. Greer, I sent word that I would be coming. I got your letter. Then you know why I'm here." "I know what you claim." Harding's mouth tightened. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to see my brother's children. I have a legal right to assess their condition." "You have no legal right to do anything until a court says so. The court will say so soon enough. In the meantime, I intend to satisfy myself that they are not being kept against their will." Silas did not move. "They are not being kept. They are being cared for. There's a difference." "Let me see them." Silas looked at the house. He could see Abigail in the kitchen window, watching. She had her hands on the counter and she was not moving. He looked back at Harding. "You will not speak to them alone. You will not touch them. You will state what you came to state, and then you will leave. That is not how this works." "It is exactly how this works on my land." Harding studied him for a long moment. Then he opened the door and stepped down. He was a tall man, well-fed, dressed in a dark suit that was too fine for a dirt yard. He walked past Silas toward the house, and Silas let him go, following a step behind. Abigail met him at the door. She did not step aside. She blocked the threshold with her body, her arms crossed, her eyes steady. "Thomas." "Abigail, I've come a long way." "You've come because you want something. I don't know what it is, but I know it's not for the children's good." "That's a harsh thing to say about a man who loved his brother." "You didn't love James. You barely spoke to him after he married me. You didn't come to his funeral. You didn't write. You didn't help." "I was busy. I had obligations." "You had money. You had time. You chose not to use either." Harding's face flushed. He glanced at Silas, then back at Abigail. "I'm not here to argue about the past. I'm here to discuss the future. The children cannot stay in this situation." "What situation? They have a roof. They have food. They have a mother who loves them. They have a mother who is living on the charity of a strange man." "I am not a strange man," Silas said. "I am her husband. We were married yesterday." The words hit Harding like a slap. He stared at Silas, then at Abigail, then back at Silas. His face went through a series of small, rapid changes: surprise, disbelief, calculation. "You married him." "I did. To block my claim. To protect my children," Abigail said. "However I have to." Harding stood in the yard with the cold wind pulling at his coat, and he looked at the house, the barn, the children he could see through the window, Nell at the table, Samuel standing by the fireplace, Henry on the floor with his horses. He looked at them for a long time, and something crossed his face that might have been grief, or might have been disappointment. It was hard to tell. "You think a marriage certificate will stop me?" he said. "I think it will make it harder," Silas said. "That's enough for now." Harding turned and walked back to his carriage. He climbed in and pulled the door shut without looking back. The driver snapped the reins, and the carriage rolled away down the lane. Silas and Abigail stood together on the porch and watched it go. "He'll be back," she said. "I know. He'll find another way." "I know." She turned to him. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. "Then we'd better be ready." They were ready, but the next move came from a direction they did not expect. 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy rode up to the ranch with a folded paper in his hand. He handed it to Silas without getting off his horse. "What is this?" "Court order," the deputy said. "Temporary guardianship hearing, set for January 6th. Judge Morrison recused himself and assigned Judge Parker from Grand Junction. You're to bring the children and the mother." Silas read the paper. It was legal and dry and final. It listed Thomas Harding as the petitioner and Abigail Harding and Silas Greer as the respondents. It gave the date and time and location. It said nothing about the marriage, nothing about the conditions on the ranch. It was a summons. "Who is Judge Parker?" Silas asked. "Don't know much about him," the deputy said. "He's new, appointed last fall. They say he's a strict man, goes by the letter of the law." The deputy tipped his hat and rode away. Silas stood in the yard with the paper in his hand, the cold biting his fingers, and he felt the walls closing in. He went inside. He showed the paper to Abigail. She read it, folded it, and put it in her apron pocket. "January 6th, she said. "That's 3 weeks. We'll be there." "With what? We have a marriage certificate. We have a house. We have a job. Is that enough?" "It has to be." She looked at him. For the first time since she had arrived, her eyes were uncertain. He has money. He has lawyers. He has a new judge who might not care about a widow and a rancher and 3 children who just want to be left alone. Then we'll give him something to care about. What? Silas thought about the ledger. He thought about the carved horse. He thought about Samuel mending the gate without being asked. About Nell reading aloud from her book. About Henry falling asleep on the rug with the horses tucked under his chin. "We'll give him the truth," he said. That night, after the children were in bed, Silas and Abigail sat at the kitchen table and went over every detail of their case. What they had, what they needed, what Harding would argue. Abigail wrote down a list of witnesses: the storekeeper in Glenwood who had seen her buy supplies, the neighbor who had traded eggs for cornmeal, the deputy who had delivered the summons, Will Hadley. She wrote down the date of the marriage, the condition of the children on arrival, the improvements they had made to the house. "We need to show that this is a stable home," she said, "that the children are thriving, that removing them would cause harm. How do we show that?" She paused. "They'll ask the children. They'll ask them what they think. Samuel will hold up. Nell will say too much. Henry, I don't know what Henry will say. Henry will say what he always says. He'll tell the truth." They were quiet for a moment. Then Abigail reached across the table and took his hand. "I was scared the day I drove up that lane," she said. "I was scared I had made a mistake, that I had brought my children to a place that would break them. I was wrong. This place didn't break them, it mended them. I didn't do anything. You did everything. You let them in. You let me in. You carved a horse for a boy you didn't have to care about." He did not know what to say. He held her hand and looked at the grain of the wood on the table, and thought about how a man can live a whole life alone and then suddenly find himself wrapped up in other people's lives so completely that he cannot remember what solitude felt like. "We'll be all right," he said. She squeezed his hand. "Yes, we will." Outside, the wind picked up. Another storm was coming. But the fire was bright, and the house was warm, and the children were sleeping. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Silas woke to find Henry standing beside his bed, holding one of the carved horses in each hand. "Mr. Greer," Henry said, "I dreamed about horses." "What kind of horses?" "The wooden kind. They were running across the table, and the mama horse said, 'We're safe now,' and the baby horse said, 'I know,' and then they ran some more." Silas sat up. He looked at the boy, at the serious face and the mismatched horses clutched in his small hands. "That sounds like a good dream," he said. "It was," Henry said. "I think they're glad we're here." "I think they are too." Henry nodded, satisfied, and padded out of the room. Silas lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling. If a judge made them leave, if Harding won, the wooden horses would go back into a wagon. The ledger would be packed. The gate would swing open in the wind again, and this house would go back to being empty. He would not let that happen. He got up, dressed, and went to the barn. There was work to do, and there was a fight coming, and he intended to be ready for both. The morning after Henry's dream, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. Silas stood on the porch and watched the clouds press down against the mountains, and he thought about the date on the summons, January 6th, 3 weeks. 21 days to build a case strong enough to stand against a man with money and a lawyer and a judge who had never laid eyes on any of them. He turned and went inside. The kitchen was warm, the fire crackling, the smell of coffee threading through the air. Abigail was at the stove, her back to him, her shoulders set in that familiar line of quiet determination. Henry was on the floor, the 2 wooden horses arranged in a line, their noses pointing toward the door as if they were waiting for something. Nell was at the table, her ledger open, her pencil moving. Samuel was not there. He had gone to the barn before dawn, as he did every morning now, without being asked. "I'm going to town today," Silas said. I need to speak to Hadley again. And I want to talk to a few people who might speak for us. Abigail turned. What people? The storekeeper, the livery man, the Hendersons who sold us the chickens. People who have seen you and the children in town. People who can say that you are not a woman hiding in the hills with no reputation. She considered this. Will they speak? I don't know, but I have to ask. She nodded and went back to the stove. He ate his breakfast in silence, and then he pulled on his heavy coat and headed for the barn. The gray mare was already saddled. Samuel had done it, anticipating the need. Silas looked at the boy, who was forking hay into the stalls, and he felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that was becoming familiar, almost comfortable. I'll be back by late afternoon, Silas said. I'll keep things here, Samuel said. It was not a question. It was a statement. And Silas realized that the boy had already taken on the responsibility of the ranch in his absence, that he trusted Samuel to handle the feeding and the watering and the 100 small tasks that kept a place alive. I know you will, Silas said. He rode out into the cold, the mare picking her way through the frozen ruts. The wind was sharp against his face, and he pulled his collar up and bent his head into it. The road to Glenwood was empty, the fields white and silent, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the horse's steady breathing. He reached the town just before 10. The main street was quiet, the hitching posts lined with ice, the boardwalks cleared only in narrow paths. He tied the mare outside the dry goods store and went in. The storekeeper was a man named Pritchard, thin and balding, with the habit of polishing his spectacles on his apron when he was thinking. He looked up when Silas entered and nodded. "Morning, Greer. Heard you got married." News traveled fast in a small town. Silas did not ask how he knew. "I did. To that widow woman, the one with the children." "That's right." Pritchard set down the jar he was holding and folded his arms. "What can I do for you?" Silas told him about the summons, about Harding's claim, about the hearing in January. He told him that he needed people who could speak to Abigail's character, to the children's condition, to the stability of the household. He did not ask for a favor. He stated the situation and let the man decide. Pritchard was quiet for a long time. He polished his spectacles. He looked out the window at the snow-covered street. "I've seen her in here 3 times, he said. Once for flour and salt, once for thread, once to buy a piece of ribbon for the little girl's hair. She paid cash each time. She was polite. She didn't linger." He paused. "I've seen the children. They're not ragged. They're not hungry. The oldest boy walks straight-backed. The girl talks to me like she's been doing business her whole life. The little one carries a wooden horse everywhere." "He does," Silas said. Pritchard nodded. "I'll say what I saw. If a judge asks me, I'll say it." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. The law is a long road, and it don't always go where it should." Silas left the store and walked to the livery stable. The liveryman was named Owens, a retired cavalryman with a missing finger and a voice like gravel. He listened to Silas's story with his arms crossed, his face giving nothing away. "I know the woman," Owens said when Silas finished. "Brought her mare in twice for new shoes, paid on time, asked good questions about the horse's feet. She knows how to handle an animal." "That's something." "It's something. It's not a legal argument, but it's something." "I'll speak if I'm called." Silas thanked him and walked back out into the street. He had 2 names now. It was not enough, but it was a start. He climbed the stairs to Hadley's office and found the lawyer at his desk, a fire burning in the stove, a pot of coffee on the hob. Hadley gestured to a chair and poured him a cup without being asked. "You look tired," Hadley said. "I've been writing since before sunup. Find anyone willing to speak?" 2 so far, Pritchard and Owens." "That's good. They're both respected. I'll add their names to the list." Hadley pulled out a folder and opened it. "I've been looking into Judge Parker. He's a former prosecutor from Denver, appointed to the bench last fall. He's known for being strict on procedure and unsympathetic to appeals based on emotion. So he's not the kind of man who will be moved by a story about a widow and her children." "No," Hadley said. "He's the kind of man who will look at the law and apply it exactly as it's written. That means we need to give him a case that fits the statute precisely. We need to show that the mother is fit, the home is stable, and the petitioner's claim has no basis in fact." "How do we do that?" Hadley leaned back. We document everything: the marriage certificate, the deed to your property, the receipts for food and supplies, a statement from the children's doctor, if they have one. They haven't seen a doctor since they arrived. Thomas broke his arm. I said it myself. Hadley raised an eyebrow. You said a child's broken arm? I've set bones before, on horses and men. It wasn't a clean break, but it healed straight. That's something too. I'll add it to the file. A man who sets a child's bone is not a man who neglects him. Silas drank his coffee. The heat spread through him, but the cold in his chest lingered. What about Harding? What's his case? He'll argue that Abigail lacks the means to provide for 3 children. He'll point out that she's been a widow for 3 years, that she's moved multiple times, that she has no permanent ties to any community. He'll say that living as a hired cook on a remote ranch is not a stable environment for children to be raised in. She's not just a hired cook, she's my wife. That helps. But Harding will argue that the marriage was arranged solely to block his claim. He'll say it's a sham. Silas set down the cup. It's not a sham. I know that, you know that. But a judge might wonder. A marriage conducted with no notice, no ceremony, no witnesses beyond the children. It looks defensive. It was defensive, but it was also true. Hadley looked at him for a long moment. I believe you, and I'll make sure Judge Parker believes you. He closed the folder. Go home. Spend time with your family. Let me handle the legal side. When the hearing comes, you'll be ready. Silas stood. There's something else. What? Dwight Collar. He's been pressing me about the north fence line. He's looking for an angle. If he and Harding are connected somehow, we could have 2 fronts to fight. Hadley's face tightened. That's a complication I didn't need. I'll ask around, see if there's any link between them. For now, keep your head down and your fences mended. Silas nodded and left. He walked back to the mare, untied her, and swung into the saddle. The sky had darkened further, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. He had a long ride ahead, and the cold was settling into his bones. But as he rode out of Glenwood, he thought about what Pritchard had said. The boy walks straight-backed. The girl talks like she's done business her whole life. The little one carries a wooden horse. Those were the things that mattered. Those were the truths that no lawyer could take away. He pushed the mare into a trot and headed home. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Abigail cleaned the house from top to bottom, as if she could scrub away the uncertainty that hung in the air. She washed the children's clothes, mended every tear, patched every hole. She baked bread and set it on the counter to cool, and she packed a bag with the essentials: papers, a change of clothes for each child, the carved horses, the ledger. Silas watched her move through the house, efficient and silent, and he understood that she was doing what she always did when the world pressed in. She made things orderly. She made them clean. She prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. On the 3rd day, a visitor came. Silas was in the barn, shoeing the gray mare, when he heard the sound of a wagon. He set down the hoof and walked to the door. A buckboard was coming up the lane, driven by a woman, a stout, gray-haired woman in a heavy coat, her face red from the wind. She pulled up in front of the house and climbed down with the ease of someone who had been doing it for decades. "Mr. Greer?" she called. "Yes, ma'am." "Name's Henderson, Martha Henderson. I live about 3 miles south. Your wife bought chickens from me back in November. I remember, she mentioned you." Martha Henderson walked toward him, her boots crunching in the snow. She was carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "I heard about the trouble. I heard there's a man trying to take those children away." Word travels fast. This is a small valley, Mr. Greer. Word travels faster than a horse can run. She held out the basket. "I brought a pie, and I brought a story. I told your wife's story to my husband, and he told it to the preacher, and the preacher told it to half the congregation after Sunday service. There are people in this valley who will stand up for you if it comes to that." Silas took the basket. The cloth was warm against his hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means more than you know. Don't thank me yet. Just make sure you bring those children to church when this is over. They need to know they belong here." She climbed back into her buckboard and drove away without another word. Silas stood in the yard with the basket in his hands and watched her go. He carried the pie inside. Abigail was at the table, her hands folded in front of her, a letter open beside her. She looked up when he came in, her face pale. "What is it?" he said. "It's from Thomas," she said. "He sent it to the Hendersons' place, addressed to me. There's a copy of a document, a court filing. He's asking for a temporary order to remove the children before the hearing." Silas set down the basket. "Can he do that?" "He's asking for an emergency hearing. He's claiming that I'm at risk of fleeing the jurisdiction, that the marriage is a sham, that the children are in danger of being removed from the territory." "That's a lie." "It's a lie," she said, "but it's a lie wrapped in legal language, and it might be enough to convince a judge who doesn't know us." Silas sat down across from her. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The house felt small and fragile, like a ship on a sea that was about to storm. "He's trying to take them before we can fight," he said. "Yes. Then we fight now." He went to the desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. He wrote a letter to Will Hadley, describing the new filing, asking for an immediate response. He sealed it and took it to the barn, where Samuel was forking hay. "Samuel, I need you to ride to Glenwood. Find Will Hadley. Give him this letter. Wait for his answer." Samuel looked at the letter, then at Silas. His face was serious, but there was no fear in it. "How fast do I need to go?" "As fast as the mare can carry you." Samuel took the letter, tucked it inside his coat, and went to saddle the horse. He was gone within 5 minutes, riding out of the yard at a steady lope, his back straight, his hands sure on the reins. Silas watched him go. The boy was 13 years old. He had a broken arm that was still healing, and he was riding into a snowstorm to deliver a letter that might determine the fate of his family. Silas turned and went back inside. Abigail was standing at the window, her hand on Henry's shoulder. Nell was at the table, writing in her ledger. "What are you writing?" Silas asked. "Everything," Nell said. "The date, the time, what Mrs. Henderson brought, what Uncle Thomas sent, what Samuel is doing right now." "Why?" She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "Because if we have to leave, I want to remember what it was like to have a home." Silas did not have an answer for that. He sat down at the table and waited. The hours passed slowly. The snow fell harder, piling against the windows, muffling the world outside. Abigail lit the lamps. She made supper. The family ate in silence, the chairs creaking, the spoons clinking against the bowls. Henry fell asleep at the table, his head resting on his folded arms, the 2 horses tucked beside his plate. Silas carried him to bed. He tucked the horses in beside him, one under each arm, and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Henry sighed in his sleep and turned his face toward the wall. Silas stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the boy. Then he went back to the kitchen. The door opened at 9 o'clock. Samuel came in, covered in snow, his cheeks bright red, his breath coming in clouds. He pulled off his hat and held out a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Hadley says to read this now." Silas took the paper and opened it. The letter was short, written in Hadley's precise hand. "Greer, I received your message. I've filed a response with the court objecting to the emergency order. I've also submitted the marriage certificate and an affidavit from Judge Morrison confirming the validity of the ceremony. If Harding's lawyer pushes for the removal, I will argue that the children have a stable home and that the marriage is not a sham. But there's more. I've heard through a colleague that Harding has been in contact with a man named Collar. I don't know what they discussed, but the timing is concerning. I will be at your ranch on the morning of January 6th. We'll ride to Grand Junction together. Hadley." Silas read the letter twice. The mention of Collar sat in his stomach like a stone. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "What does it say?" Abigail asked. "Hadley is fighting the emergency order, and he thinks Collar and Harding are working together." Abigail's face went still. "That changes things. It changes how we prepare. If Collar is involved, he's not just after the land, he's after the whole situation. He wants us gone, and Harding wants the children gone. Together, they're stronger." Samuel was still standing by the door, dripping snow onto the floor. "What do we do?" Silas looked at him. The boy was tired, cold, hungry. But he had ridden through a storm and come back, and he was asking what came next. "We go to the hearing," Silas said. "We tell the truth, and we trust that a judge can tell the difference between a man who wants to take something and a man who wants to protect it." Samuel nodded. He pulled off his coat and hung it by the fire. He sat down at the table, and Abigail put a bowl of stew in front of him. He ate without speaking, and the house settled into the rhythm of the storm. That night Silas could not sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind and the creak of the house, and he thought about Collar and Harding and the judge he had never met. He thought about the children sleeping in the next room, about the ledger Nell kept, about the wooden horses Henry carried everywhere. He thought about the gate Samuel had fixed, the fence that held against the wind, the roof he had shoveled, the wood he had stacked. He thought about the smell of bread and the sound of laughter and the weight of Abigail's hand in his at the wedding. He would not lose any of it. He got up, dressed, and went downstairs. The fire was still glowing in the hearth. He added a log and sat in the chair by the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the world was dark and silent. He sat there for a long time, not thinking, just being present in the house he had built, in the life that had grown around him without his permission. A creak on the stairs. He turned. Abigail was standing at the bottom of the steps, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep either?" she said. "No." She crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair, her shoulder brushing his. They sat in silence, watching the fire. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she said. "I was so scared. I had been scared for 3 years, but that day was different. I was scared that I had run out of road, that there was nowhere left to go. And now? Now I'm scared that I have somewhere to go and that it might be taken away." He reached up and took her hand. It was cold. He wrapped his fingers around it and held it against his chest. "I'm scared too," he said. "But I've been scared before. I've lost things before. And I'm still here." "So am I." "Then we're both still here. That counts for something." They sat together until the fire burned low and the first gray light began to creep through the windows. And when the sun finally rose, they were still there, holding each other's hands, ready for whatever the day would bring. The morning of January 4th broke clear and bitter cold, the sky a hard, empty blue that promised no mercy. Silas stood on the porch and watched the sun climb over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. In 2 days, they would be in Grand Junction. In 2 days, a judge would decide whether the children stayed or went. He had not slept well. He had not slept well in weeks, but the exhaustion had settled into something deeper than tiredness, a kind of hollow calm that came when a man stopped fighting the inevitable and simply prepared for it. Abigail came out and stood beside him. She had Thomas on her hip, his arm out of the sling now, but still held close to his chest out of habit. The 2 horses were tucked into his coat pocket, their heads poking out like small passengers. "The wagon is packed," she said. "Hadley sent word that we should leave today, stay overnight in town, and ride to Grand Junction in the morning. He doesn't want to risk the roads on the day of the hearing." Silas nodded. "Samuel hitched the mare. She's steady." "She's old. She's steady." They stood together in the cold, their breath mingling in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty fields. "I keep thinking about what we'll do if he wins," Abigail said. "If the judge gives him temporary custody." "I try not to think about that. I can't stop." He turned to look at her. Her face was composed, but he had learned to see the cracks in the armor, the slight tremor in her jaw, the way her hand tightened on Thomas's back. "Then think about this," he said. "If he wins, we fight. We appeal. We take it to a higher court. We do whatever it takes. And in the meantime, we make sure those children know they are loved. No judge can take that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back inside. They left an hour later. The wagon was loaded with bedding, food, the ledger, the horses, and a change of clothes for everyone. Samuel rode beside the wagon on the gray mare, his broken arm held stiff but functional. Nell sat in the back with Thomas, her ledger open on her lap, writing as they moved. Abigail sat on the bench beside Silas, her hands folded on her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The ride to Glenwood took 3 hours. The roads were packed snow, frozen hard enough to hold the wagon, but rough enough to jar the teeth. Silas kept the mare at a steady walk, not pushing her, not wanting to risk a fall. The children were quiet, wrapped in blankets, their faces hidden from the wind. They arrived in Glenwood just after noon. Hadley was waiting for them at the hotel, a small two-story building on the main street. He helped them unload and led them inside, where a fire was burning and a pot of coffee was waiting. "I've reserved 2 rooms," he said. "You and the children in one, Silas in the other. We leave at first light." "That gives us an evening to prepare," Abigail said. "It does. I've drawn up a list of questions the judge might ask. I want to go over them tonight." They ate a simple dinner in the hotel dining room. Thomas fell asleep with his head on the table, his hands still clutching the horses. Nell ate quietly, her eyes moving around the room, taking in every detail. Samuel ate methodically, cleaning his plate, then asking for more. After dinner, they gathered in Hadley's room. The lawyer sat by the fire, a stack of papers on his lap. Abigail sat on the bed, the children around her. Silas stood by the window, looking out at the dark street. "Tomorrow," Hadley said, "Judge Parker will hear testimony from both sides. He will question you, Mr. Greer. He will question you, Mrs. Greer, and he will question the children." "Why the children?" Silas asked. "Because their welfare is the central issue. He needs to determine what they want, what they need, and whether their current situation is stable." Nell looked up from her ledger. "Will he ask us?" "He may. Are you ready for that?" "I'm ready for anything." Hadley smiled, a thin, tired smile. "I believe you are." He went through the questions methodically. "Where do you sleep? What do you eat? Do you have a school? Do you have friends? Do you feel safe?" He asked Abigail about her marriage to James, about the years after his death, about the decision to come to Silas's ranch. He asked Silas about his history, his land, his reasons for hiring a widow with 3 children. "He will press you on the timing of the marriage," Hadley said. "He will suggest that it was a legal maneuver, not a sincere union." "It was both," Silas said. "I know, but the judge will need to hear that from you, not defensively, calmly, clearly." Silas nodded. He understood. The truth was on his side, but the truth had to be spoken in the right way. They went to bed early. Silas lay in his room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the hotel. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. A voice murmured. Then silence. He thought about the day ahead. He thought about the judge's face, the questions he would ask, the answers he would give. He thought about Collar and Harding and whatever alliance they had forged. He thought about the children sleeping in the next room, their fates hanging on the words of a stranger. He did not sleep. At dawn, they loaded the wagon again and set out for Grand Junction. The road was longer and rougher, climbing through the foothills, the snow deeper in the passes. The mare struggled on the uphill stretches, and Samuel dismounted and walked beside her, coaxing her forward with quiet words. Silas drove with his hands firm on the reins, his eyes scanning the road ahead. They reached Grand Junction at noon. The town was larger than Glenwood, with a brick courthouse at its center and a main street lined with businesses. Hadley directed them to a boarding house near the courthouse, where they left the wagon and the mare. "The hearing is at 2 o'clock, Hadley said. "We have time to eat and prepare." They ate in silence. No one was hungry, but they forced themselves to swallow. Thomas picked at his bread, his eyes wide and uncertain. Nell ate mechanically, her ledger closed but her hand resting on it, as if she needed to feel it under her fingers. At 1:45 they walked to the courthouse. The building was cold inside, the hallways echoing with the sound of footsteps. A clerk directed them to a courtroom on the second floor, a large room with tall windows and a raised bench at the far end. Judge Parker was already seated when they entered. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a narrow face and spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked at them over the rims as they took their seats, his expression giving nothing away. Thomas Harding was already there. He sat at a table on the opposite side of the room, flanked by a lawyer in a dark suit. Harding did not look at them. He stared straight ahead, his hands folded on the table. "All rise," the bailiff said. "The Honorable Judge Parker presiding." The judge called the case. He read the petition, the responses, the affidavits. Then he looked up. Let the record show that this is a guardianship hearing concerning the minor children Caleb, Lucy, and Thomas Harding, the children of the deceased James Harding, and the respondent Abigail Greer. The petitioner, Thomas Harding, seeks temporary custody, pending a full hearing on permanent guardianship. The respondents, Abigail Greer and her husband, Silas Greer, oppose the petition. He paused, looking down at his notes. I have reviewed the filings. I have read the affidavits. I have considered the marriage certificate and the statements from the respondents' witnesses. I have also received a letter from Mr. Harding's counsel alleging that the marriage was entered into as a means of circumventing this court's authority. He looked up, his eyes moving from Harding to Abigail to Silas. This court will hear testimony. I will make my decision based on the evidence presented, not on emotion or presumption. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, Hadley said. Harding's lawyer nodded. The judge began with the petitioner. Harding took the stand and testified about his relationship with his brother, his concern for the children, his belief that Abigail was unfit to raise them. He spoke smoothly, his words measured, his tone reasonable. He described the years of instability, the moves, the lack of permanent employment. He painted a picture of a woman who was struggling, who could not provide, who had placed her children at risk. Silas watched Abigail during this testimony. She sat very still, her hands in her lap, her face unreadable. But he saw the way her fingers pressed into her palms, the slight tightening of her jaw. When Harding finished, Hadley cross-examined. He asked about the funeral, about the letters that were never sent, about the offers of help that were never made. Harding's answers grew shorter, his confidence fading, but he held his ground. Then it was Abigail's turn. She walked to the stand with her back straight. She sat down, placed her hands on the rail, and looked at the judge. Mrs. Greer, the judge said, this court has heard that you have struggled to provide for your children since your husband's death. Can you speak to that? I have struggled, she said. There is no shame in that. I was widowed at 28 with 3 children and no savings. I worked where I could. I moved when I had to. I did what mothers have always done. I kept them alive. And now? Now I am married. I have a home. I have a husband who provides for us. My children are fed, clothed, and warm. They have a future here. Your marriage is very recent. It is. Would you describe it as a marriage of convenience? She paused. The courtroom was silent. The fire in the stove crackled. No, Your Honor, she said. I would describe it as a marriage of necessity. I needed a home. He needed a family. But that does not make it any less real. I care for him. He cares for me. And he cares for my children as if they were his own. The judge wrote something down. Mr. Greer carved a wooden horse for your youngest son. Is that correct? Abigail's voice wavered for the first time. Yes, Your Honor. Why is that relevant? Because a man who carves a wooden horse for a child who is not his son has already decided to be a father. The judge looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Silas. Mr. Greer, please take the stand. Silas walked forward. He sat down, his hands resting on his knees. He had never been in a courtroom before. The wood was polished, the air smelled of old paper and dust. He looked at the judge and waited. Mr. Greer, you have lived alone on this ranch for 6 years. Why did you decide to hire a cook? Because my back was giving out and I couldn't cook my own meals without pain. And when Mrs. Greer arrived with 3 children, why did you hire her? Because she needed the work and I needed the help. But the work required only one person. Why did you allow the children to stay? Silas looked at the judge. He thought about the moment on the lane, the broken wheel, the 3 faces peering at him from behind their mother's arm. He thought about the bread she had brought, the way it smelled after 6 years of eating alone. Because she didn't ask for charity, he said. She asked for a chance. And I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in a long time. I saw someone who was willing to fight for what she had. And you married her? Yes. Why? Because I wanted to protect her. Because I wanted to protect the children. Because I realized that I didn't want to live alone anymore. The judge studied him. Do you love her? Silas did not hesitate. Yes, Your Honor, I do. A murmur ran through the small audience. The judge silenced it with a look. He then called the children. Samuel walked to the stand. He sat down, his face set, his eyes straight ahead. The judge asked him about the ranch, about his work, about how he was treated. "Mr. Greer taught me to fix a gate," Samuel said. "He showed me how to shoe a horse. He trusts me to take care of things when he's away." "Do you feel safe?" "Yes." "Do you want to stay?" "Yes." "Why?" Samuel looked at his mother, then at Silas. "Because this is the first place I've been since my father died where I don't feel like I'm a burden." The judge nodded. He called Lucy next. Nell walked to the stand with her ledger under her arm. She sat down and opened it without being asked. "What is that book?" the judge asked. "It's my record of everything," she said. "Things that happened, things that matter." "May I see it?" She handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. He flipped through the pages, reading silently. Then he looked up. "You keep track of meals, of injuries, of kindnesses?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if you don't write things down, they get lost, and these things are worth keeping." The judge closed the ledger and handed it back. "Thank you, young lady," he called Thomas last. Henry walked to the stand slowly, his 2 wooden horses clutched in his hands. He had to climb onto the chair. The judge leaned forward. "Hello, young man." "Hello." "What are those?" "These are my horses, the mama and the baby." "Did someone make them for you?" "The baby one, Mr. Greer made it." "And the mama one?" "My papa made it, before he died." The judge was quiet for a moment. "Do you like living with Mr. Greer?" "Yes." "Why?" Henry looked down at the horses. Then he said, "Because he said they were fine horses." "And he doesn't lie." The judge leaned back. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at Harding, at Abigail, at Silas. Then he stood. "This court will adjourn for 1 hour. I will deliver my ruling at 4 o'clock." He left the bench. The bailiff called the room to order, and then the doors opened, and people began to file out. Silas sat frozen. The hour stretched ahead of him like a desert. He looked at Abigail. She was holding Thomas, her face pale, her eyes searching his. "He listened," she said. "He listened, but I don't know what he heard." They waited in the hallway. Harding's lawyer walked past them without a word. Harding himself sat on a bench at the far end, his face unreadable. Samuel stood against the wall, his arms crossed. Nell was writing in her ledger. Thomas was asleep on his mother's lap, the horses still clutched in his hands. At 4 o'clock, the bailiff opened the doors. Judge Parker took the bench. He waited for the room to settle. Then he looked at the papers in front of him. "This court has heard testimony from both sides. I have reviewed the affidavits. I have considered the marriage certificate. I have spoken to the children." He paused. "The petitioner has argued that the respondent is unfit to care for her children due to instability and lack of resources. He has argued that the marriage to Mr. Greer was a legal maneuver designed to block his claim." He looked up. "I find that the petitioner has not met his burden of proof. The evidence before me shows a mother who has kept her children alive through difficult circumstances. It shows a husband who has provided a stable home and has demonstrated a genuine commitment to the children's welfare. It shows children who are healthy, educated, and clearly attached to their mother and to their new home." Silas felt his heart hammering in his chest. "Therefore, the petition for temporary guardianship is denied. The children shall remain in the custody of their mother, Abigail Greer, and her husband, Silas Greer." A sound escaped Abigail's throat, a small, broken cry. She buried her face against Thomas's head. "However," the judge continued, "I will schedule a full hearing on the matter of permanent guardianship in 3 months. At that time, the court will reassess the situation. I expect the respondents to continue providing a stable home. I expect the petitioner to respect the court's ruling in the meantime." He banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." The room erupted into motion. Harding stood, his face tight, and walked out without looking back. His lawyer followed, gathering papers. Abigail was crying. Silas had never seen her cry before. She was holding Thomas and crying, and Samuel was standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, and Nell was writing furiously in her ledger, and Silas stood in the middle of it all, not knowing what to do with his hands. Hadley came over and shook his hand. "You did well, all of you." Silas nodded. He could not speak. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon air. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the street. The children climbed into the wagon. Abigail sat on the bench, still holding Thomas, her face wet. Silas climbed up beside her. He took the reins. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He clicked his tongue, and the mare began to walk. They had 3 months. It was not a victory. It was a reprieve. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. The wagon rolled away from Grand Junction with the gray mare setting a steady pace, her hooves crunching through the frozen ruts. The sun hung low and orange, casting the snow-covered fields in a light that seemed almost warm, though the air was sharp enough to cut through wool and leather. Silas drove with his hands loose on the reins, his shoulders down for the first time in weeks. Beside him, Abigail held Thomas against her chest, her cheek resting on the top of his head. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were still red, and every few minutes she let out a breath that sounded like she had been holding it for hours. In the back of the wagon, Samuel sat with his back against the sideboard, his legs stretched out, his good hand resting on his knee. He was looking at the sky, his face unreadable. Nell had her ledger open, her pencil moving in quick, precise strokes. She was writing down everything, the judge's words, the sound of the gavel, the way her mother had cried, the way Silas had sat on the stand and said, "I do," to the question about love. "What are you writing now?" Samuel asked, not turning his head. "Everything," Nell said. "So we don't forget. We won't forget this." "Maybe not, but I'm writing it anyway." Silas listened to them without interrupting. The sound of their voices, ordinary and unguarded, was something he had learned to treasure without ever saying so. He clicked his tongue, and the mare picked up her pace. They stopped at a way station outside of Palisade to rest the horse and warm themselves by the fire. The station keeper was a woman named Grace, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, who took one look at the children and brought out a plate of dried apples and a pot of hot tea without being asked. She did not ask where they had come from or where they were going. She just set the food on the table and said, "You look like you could use a quiet hour." They sat by the fire, the children eating, the adults drinking tea. Thomas had fallen asleep on Abigail's lap, the 2 horses clutched in his hands. Nell was drawing in the margins of her ledger. Samuel had found a piece of rope and was tying knots, his fingers moving with the automatic precision of someone who needed his hands busy. Abigail looked at Silas across the table. "We won today." "We won today," he agreed. "But it's not over." "No." She looked down at Thomas. 3 months. That's not a long time. It's long enough to build a case. It's long enough to show the judge that this isn't temporary. It's long enough to make sure those children know they belong to us. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter. Something like trust. They reached the ranch after dark. The house was cold, the fire having burned down to ash, but the walls were still standing, and the roof was still sound. Silas carried Thomas inside while Abigail lit the lamps and Samuel started a fire. Nell brought in her ledger and set it on the table, as if marking the territory. Within an hour, the house was warm. Abigail had made a simple supper of beans and bread, and they ate at the table together, the same arrangement they had kept since the first night. Silas at the head. The children at the far end, Abigail at the corner, close enough to reach Thomas if he needed her. After supper, Samuel went to the barn to check on the horses without being asked. Nell put Thomas to bed, reading him a story from the ledger, a list of the day's events, which she narrated in a soft, steady voice. Thomas listened with his eyes half closed, the wooden horses tucked under his chin. Silas and Abigail sat alone in the kitchen. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. "What did you think of Judge Parker?" Abigail asked. "I think he's a man who follows the law. That's good for us, as long as we stay on the right side of it. And if Harding finds a way to push us off that side, then we stay on it anyway." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm from the fire. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saying what you said, on the stand, when he asked if you loved me." Silas looked at their hands. "I didn't say it for the judge. I said it because it's true." I know." She paused. "I didn't expect to find this. I came here hoping for a roof and a wage. I didn't come here looking for anything else." "Neither did I. And yet, here we are. Here we are." They sat in silence for a while, the fire settling, the house creaking around them. Then Abigail stood and kissed him on the forehead, a gesture so simple and so intimate that it caught him off guard. "Good night, Silas." "Good night." She went to the children's room. He stayed at the table, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. He had won a battle, but the war was still ahead, and he intended to be ready. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was new and yet already familiar. Silas rose before dawn and went to the barn. Abigail had breakfast ready by the time he came back in, the table set, the coffee hot. Samuel worked beside Silas through the morning, learning the rhythms of the ranch, the names of the tools, the way the land breathed in the winter. Nell kept the accounts, recording every purchase, every trade, every egg laid by the chickens. Thomas followed Silas everywhere, his wooden horses in his pockets, asking questions that were sometimes so sharp and so simple that they stopped Silas cold. On the 5th day after the hearing, a letter arrived. It was from Will Hadley, and it was short. "Silas, Harding has not filed any new motions. He is waiting. But I have heard from my contact in Denver that he has been meeting with Collar's lawyer, a man named Vance. I do not know what they are planning, but I wanted you to know. Keep your head down. Keep your family close." Hadley Silas read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in his pocket. He did not tell Abigail about it right away. He did not want to trouble her with the shadow of something that had not yet taken shape. But he carried it with him through the day, a weight in his coat that he could not set down. That evening, Samuel came to him in the barn. The boy had been quiet all day, more withdrawn than usual. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Mr. Greer," he said, "what is it? I want to learn how to shoot." Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. "Why?" "Because if that man comes back, I want to be able to protect my family." Silas set down the harness. He studied the boy's face, the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes. He saw something there that he recognized. It was the same thing he had seen in his own face years ago, when he had decided that he would never be helpless again. "All right," Silas said. "Tomorrow morning before breakfast." Samuel nodded and left. Silas sat in the barn for a long time after that, thinking about what it meant to teach a boy to handle a weapon, thinking about what it meant to be trusted with that responsibility. The next morning, before the sun was fully over the mountains, Silas took Samuel to the far edge of the north pasture, where the land was flat and the backstop was a hillside of packed snow. He had brought an old revolver, a .45 that had been his father's, and a box of cartridges. He showed Samuel how to load it, how to hold it, how to aim. He did not teach him to be quick. He taught him to be careful. Samuel fired his first shot and missed the target by a wide margin. The recoil surprised him, and he stepped back, resetting his stance. The second shot was closer. The third hit the edge of the tin can Silas had set up on a post. "Good," Silas said. "You're learning." Samuel looked at the gun in his hands. "My father never taught me this. He said violence was for men who couldn't use words. Your father was right, in his way. But there are men in this world who don't listen to words. A man who knows how to defend himself is less likely to need to." Samuel nodded. He raised the gun again, and this time his hand was steady. They practiced for an hour, until the cold drove them back to the house. When they walked in, Abigail was at the stove. She looked at them, at the gun in Samuel's hand, and her face tightened. But she did not say anything. She set breakfast on the table and called the children to eat. That afternoon, Silas found Nell in the front room, writing in her ledger. He sat down across from her. "What are you working on?" "I'm writing a letter," she said, not looking up. "To who?" "To Judge Parker." He leaned forward. "What does it say?" "It says that we are happy here. It says that Thomas sleeps through the night now. It says that Samuel stopped having nightmares. It says that you carved a horse for my brother, and that my mother laughs for the first time in 3 years. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. "I want him to know who we are, not just what the lawyers say we are, who we really are." Silas did not know what to say. He sat there looking at this 9-year-old girl who had taken it upon herself to tell their story to a judge, and he felt something crack open in his chest. "Will you read it to me?" he asked. She did. It was 3 pages long, written in her careful hand, filled with details he had not noticed she had noticed. The way he always checked on the horses before coming inside. The way he saved the last biscuit for Thomas. The way he had fixed the gate after Samuel broke his arm. She had written about the day Henry arrived, about the muddy path, about the smell of bread. She had written about Silas's hands, how they were rough but gentle. When she finished, the room was quiet. Silas cleared his throat. "That's a fine letter," he said. "Will you help me send it?" "Yes." She folded it and tucked it into an envelope. She wrote the judge's name on the front, and she set it by the door, ready for the next trip to town. 2 weeks later, a reply came. The judge wrote that he had received her letter and that he appreciated her honesty. He did not say anything about the case. He did not make any promises. But he had written back, and that was something. Nell added the letter to her ledger, pressing it flat between the pages. She did not show it to anyone, but she carried the ledger with her everywhere, and Silas knew that the judge's words were safe inside it. The month of January passed slowly. The snow deepened, and the days were short, and the house became a world unto itself. They read by lamplight. They told stories. They played games that Nell invented, games of counting and measuring and mapping the stars. Thomas learned to write his name, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth as he guided the pencil across the page. Samuel finished a set of leather repairs that Silas had been meaning to do for a year. Abigail canned the last of the winter vegetables and baked bread that filled the house with warmth. And the bond between them all grew, quietly and steadily, like roots reaching through frozen ground, patient and determined. Silas found himself thinking less about the hearing and more about the small moments that filled his days. Henry's hand in his, Nell's voice reading aloud, Samuel's quiet competence, Abigail's steady presence in the kitchen. It was a dangerous thing, he knew, to let himself feel at home. The blow came at the end of the first week of February. Hadley arrived at the ranch in the middle of a snowstorm, his horse lathered and exhausted, his face white with cold and something else, urgency. He came inside without knocking, stamping snow off his boots at the door. "They've moved the hearing," he said. Silas stood up. "What?" Harding's lawyer filed a motion citing changed circumstances. They claim that the children are at risk here, that the winter isolation constitutes neglect, that the lack of formal education is damaging. They've convinced Judge Parker to move the hearing to March 1st. Abigail came out of the kitchen, her hands covered in flour. "That's 3 weeks away." 3 weeks, Hadley confirmed, and they've added new witnesses. Collar is one of them. The name dropped into the room like a stone. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. "What can he testify to?" Abigail asked. "He'll say that the property is remote, that winter access is difficult, that a family with young children would be better off in town, where there's a school and a doctor and a church. He'll make it sound reasonable. He'll make it sound like concern." "It's not concern," Silas said. "It's a land grab." "I know, but in front of a judge it looks different. A neighbor expressing worry about children in a harsh environment carries weight." Nell came to stand beside her mother. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "What do we do?" she asked. Silas looked at her, then he looked at Hadley. "We prepare," he said. "We meet every argument they make. We bring our own witnesses. We show that this ranch is not a hardship, it's a home." Hadley nodded slowly. "I'll need a list. Anyone who can speak to the children's well-being. The Henderson woman, the schoolteacher in Glenwood, if there is one, the doctor who treated Samuel's arm." "I set Samuel's arm," Silas said. "Then we need someone who can attest that it healed properly. A doctor's statement to that effect could counter the argument that the children lack medical care." Silas thought about it. "There's a doctor in Grand Junction, Dr. Treadwell. He treated me once for a riding injury. He seemed honest. I'll contact him." They sat at the table, Hadley pulling out papers, Abigail setting coffee in front of him, the children gathering around, listening. The storm raged outside, but inside, they were building their case, stone by stone. "There's one more thing," Hadley said. The judge has agreed to hear the children's testimony again. He asked specifically for the girl with the ledger. Nell looked up. Me? Yes. He said he wanted to hear from you again. He said your first testimony was remarkably clear. She did not smile. She did not preen. She just nodded and opened her ledger to a fresh page. I'll be ready, she said. That night, after Hadley had left and the children were in bed, Silas and Abigail sat by the fire. The wind howled against the windows, but the house was warm. He's not going to stop, Abigail said. Harding. He'll keep coming until he wins or until we're too exhausted to fight. Then we don't get exhausted. That's not a plan. No, Silas agreed, but it's a start. She looked at him. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the lines of worry. What if we lose? He reached over and took her hand. Then we find another way. We go to a different territory. We start over. As long as we're together, we start over. Her hand tightened on his. You'd do that? Leave this land? He did not answer right away. He looked around the room, the walls he had built, the roof he had repaired, the floor he had swept 1,000 times. He thought about the north pasture, the fence line, the gate Samuel had fixed. He thought about the mare in the barn, the chickens in the coop, the wood stacked against the wall. I built this place for myself, he said, but it's not myself anymore. It's us. If us has to leave, then the land can wait. The land will still be here when we come back. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the firelight, listening to the storm. The next morning, Silas woke to find that the snow had stopped. The sky was clear, the world a sheet of white, and the sun was rising over the mountains. He dressed and went outside, and as he stood on the porch, he saw something that made him stop. Henry was in the yard, standing in the snow in his boots and coat, holding the 2 wooden horses. He was talking to them, his voice low and serious, moving them across the surface of a drift as if they were galloping across a field. Where are they going? Silas asked, coming down the steps. Henry looked up. They're going to find a place where no one can take them. Is there such a place? Henry thought about it. I think so. It's where people love you, and you don't have to leave. Silas crouched down beside him. He looked at the horses, the mama and the baby, standing in the snow. That's a good place, he said. Will we find it? I think we already have. Henry looked at him, his eyes serious. Then he picked up the horses and held them out to Silas. Do you want to hold them? Silas took the horses carefully. They were small and worn, the mama chipped and faded, the baby rough and uneven. He held them in his hands, and he understood that he was being entrusted with something sacred. Thank you, he said. Henry nodded and ran back into the house. Silas stood in the snow, holding the wooden horses, and watched the sun climb higher over the mountains. He would not lose this. He would not let them be taken. He had spent 6 years alone, believing that solitude was safety. He had been wrong. Safety was this: a house full of voices, a boy who trusted him with his horses, a woman who leaned her head on his shoulder. He tucked the horses into his coat pocket and went inside to start the day. The days after Hadley's visit passed in a blur of preparation and quiet desperation. Silas woke each morning before dawn and worked until his hands ached, mending fences, stocking wood, checking every corner of the ranch for anything that could be used against them. He knew that Collar's testimony would paint the place as remote and dangerous, and he intended to show that it was neither. He cleared the lane of snow until the ground showed through. He reinforced the roof of the chicken coop. He patched a section of the barn wall that had been letting in drafts for 2 years. Abigail worked with the same fierce energy. She scrubbed the house until the floors gleamed. She organized the pantry, cataloging every jar of preserves, every sack of flour, every pound of salt. She wrote down menus, schedules, a daily routine that proved the children were fed, educated, and cared for. She taught Nell how to make a proper household ledger with columns for income and expenses, and Nell filled page after page with her precise handwriting. Samuel took on the task of documenting the land. He walked every fence line, noting the condition of the posts, the stretches that needed repair, the places where the snow drifted deepest. He drew a map, crude but accurate, showing the location of the house, the barn, the well, the woodpile, the chicken coop, the pasture. He labeled everything in a careful hand and presented it to Silas without a word. "This is good," Silas said, studying the map. "This is real good," Samuel shrugged, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. Henry, too young to understand the stakes, contributed in his own way. He carried his wooden horses everywhere, arranging them on the windowsill, the kitchen table, the foot of his bed. He talked to them constantly, telling them stories about the ranch, about the horses in the barn, about Mr. Greer, who had made the baby horse and who never forgot to say good night. Nell wrote her second letter to Judge Parker. This one was longer, more detailed. She described the daily routine: breakfast at 6, chores until noon, lessons in the afternoon, supper at 6, stories by the fire. She described the books they were reading, the sums she was learning, the way Thomas had stopped waking up crying in the night. She described the bread her mother baked, and the way Mr. Greer always saved the last biscuit for Thomas. She described the gate Samuel had fixed, and the map he had drawn, and the way the snow looked in the morning when the sun hit it just right. She did not mention Harding or Collar. She did not mention the hearing. She simply told the truth about their life, and she sent the letter with the next supply wagon that passed by the ranch. The reply came 10 days later. Judge Parker wrote that he had received her second letter and that he would take it into consideration. He did not say anything else, but he had written back, and that was enough to give Nell a quiet, satisfied smile. The last week of February arrived with a cold snap that froze the water in the trough and sent the animals huddling into the barn for warmth. Silas spent the days chopping ice and carrying hay, his breath pluming in the air, his hands raw from the cold. At night, he sat by the fire with Abigail, going over the case, rehearsing what they would say, anticipating every question the judge might ask. "I'm worried about Collar," Abigail said one evening. "He's a convincing liar." "He's not lying. He's telling the truth about the ranch being remote. The truth is the hardest thing to argue against. But it's not the whole truth." "No, but the judge will hear what Collar says, and then he'll hear what we say, and then he'll decide." "What if he decides against us?" Silas looked into the fire. "Then we find another way." "Another way where?" "I don't know, but we'll find it." She leaned against him, and they sat in silence, watching the flames. On the morning of February 25th, a rider came up the lane. It was not Hadley, not Harding, not Collar. It was a boy, no older than Samuel, riding a piebald pony that looked too small for the distance it had traveled. He carried a letter, sealed with wax, and he handed it to Silas without dismounting. "From Mr. Hadley," the boy said. "He said to give it to you direct." Silas opened it. The letter was short. "Silas, Harding has filed an additional motion. He is requesting that the children be placed in temporary custody, pending the hearing, citing imminent risk of harm. He has submitted a sworn statement from Collar claiming that you have made threats against his property and that the children are in danger as a result. I have filed an emergency response, but the judge will hear arguments tomorrow morning in Grand Junction. I need you there. Hadley." Silas read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in his pocket. He looked at the boy. "Tell Mr. Hadley I'll be there." The boy nodded and rode away. Silas went inside. Abigail was at the table, her hands on the ledger, her eyes searching his face before he could speak. "What happened?" he told her. She listened without interrupting, her face growing pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He's trying to take them before the hearing," she said. "Yes. Can he do that?" "Hadley says he's arguing imminent risk. If the judge believes him, he could issue a temporary order." "What do we do?" "I go to Grand Junction. I talk to Hadley. I fight it." "Alone?" "No." He turned to the door. "Samuel, saddle the mare." "You're coming with me." Samuel stood up without a word and went to the barn. Abigail crossed the room and took Silas's hands. "Be careful." "I will. Bring them back." He looked at her. The fear in her eyes was raw, unguarded. He had seen her face down Harding, stand before a judge, hold her children together through years of loss. But this was different. This was the moment when everything could be taken away. "I will," he said. He kissed her forehead, then pulled on his coat and walked out into the cold. The ride to Grand Junction took 5 hours. Silas pushed the mare harder than he wanted to, But the roads were rough, and the daylight was short. Samuel rode beside him on the gray mare, his face set, his hand resting on the saddlebag where the revolver was wrapped in oilcloth. They reached the town just before sunset. The streets were quiet, the lamps being lit, the cold settling in. They found Hadley at his boarding house, pacing the floor, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. "Collar's statement is detailed," Hadley said without preamble. "He claims you threatened him with violence over the fence line. He claims you said you'd do whatever it took to keep your land. He's painted you as a desperate man, capable of anything." "It's a lie." "I know, but it's a lie that fits a pattern. A man who lives alone for 6 years, then suddenly marries a widow and takes in 3 children. A judge might see that as a man creating a family to cover his tracks." "Cover what tracks?" "I don't know. Harding's lawyer will spin it however they want. They'll say you're unstable, that the children are at risk, that a temporary placement is the safest option until a full hearing can be held." Silas sat down heavily. The exhaustion of the ride and the weight of the news pressed down on him. "What do we do?" "We argue tomorrow morning. I've submitted our response, but we need to be ready to speak. The judge will want to hear from you directly." "I'll be there." Hadley looked at him. "There's something else. The judge has agreed to hear from the children again, but only if they're present. You brought Samuel?" "He's outside with the horses." "Good. His testimony could make a difference." Silas nodded. He had not planned to bring Samuel into the courtroom again, but if it helped, he would do it. They spent the evening preparing, going over possible questions, rehearsing answers. Samuel sat in the corner, listening, asking an occasional question. He was calm, focused, the same quiet steadiness he had shown since the first day. "I'll say what I said before," Samuel said, "that I'm safe, that I want to stay, that Mr. Greer is a good man." "That's all you need to say," Hadley said. The night was long. Silas lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the boarding house. Somewhere in the next room, Samuel was sleeping. In another town, Abigail was holding Henry and Nell, waiting for news. He did not sleep. The hearing was held in the same courtroom, with Judge Parker on the same bench. The room was cold, the windows frosted, the air heavy with tension. Harding was already there, seated at his table, his lawyer beside him. Collar sat in the back row, his face placid, his hands folded. Silas took his seat beside Hadley. Samuel sat behind them, straight-backed, his eyes fixed on the judge. Judge Parker called the court to order. He read the motion, the responses, the affidavits. Then he looked up. "This court has received a sworn statement from Mr. Dwight Collar, alleging that the respondent, Mr. Silas Greer, has made threats of violence and that the children in his care are at risk as a result. The petitioner has moved for emergency temporary custody, pending a full hearing on permanent guardianship." He paused. "This is a serious charge. If true, it would constitute grounds for immediate removal. I have therefore called this hearing to determine the credibility of the allegation." He looked at Silas. "Mr. Greer, do you wish to respond?" Silas stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He walked to the stand, was sworn in, and sat down. His hands were steady. His voice was steady. "Mr. Greer, have you ever threatened Mr. Collar with violence?" "No, Your Honor." "Have you ever stated that you would do whatever it took to keep your land?" "I said I would do whatever it took to protect my family. I did not say I would use violence against Mr. Collar or anyone else." "Did you ever threaten Mr. Collar's property?" "No, Your Honor. I have maintained my fence line according to my deed. Mr. Collar has disputed that line. I have not threatened him over it." Judge Parker looked at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Collar's statement is quite specific. He claims you said, quote, 'I'll burn this whole valley before I let you take what's mine.' That's a lie." "How can you prove it's a lie?" Silas thought. "I have witnesses. My wife was present when Mr. Collar came to the property. She heard the conversation. She can testify that I said no such thing." The judge nodded. "Mrs. Greer is not here today." "No, Your Honor. She is at home with the younger children. But I have brought my oldest stepson, Samuel Harding. He was also present for that conversation." The judge looked at Samuel. "Is the boy prepared to testify?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well. Mr. Harding, please take the stand." Samuel walked to the stand with the same calm he had shown before. He was sworn in, and he sat down, his hands on his knees. "Samuel," the judge said, "do you remember the day Mr. Collar came to the ranch?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Can you tell me what you heard Mr. Greer say to Mr. Collar?" "Mr. Greer told him that the fence line was where it had always been. He said he would not sell his land. He told Mr. Collar to leave." "Did he threaten Mr. Collar?" "No, Your Honor." "Did he say anything about burning the valley?" "No, Your Honor." The judge studied him. "Are you certain?" "Yes, Your Honor. I remember everything about that day. I was standing by the barn door. I heard every word." The judge wrote something down. He looked at Collar. "Mr. Collar, please take the stand." Collar rose and walked to the stand with the easy confidence of a man who had told lies before and been believed. He was sworn in and he sat down, his hands resting on the rail. "Mr. Collar," the judge said, "you have submitted a sworn statement alleging that Mr. Greer threatened you. Can you describe the context of that threat?" "Your Honor, I went to Mr. Greer's property to discuss a boundary dispute in a neighborly manner. He became agitated. He told me that I would regret coming onto his land. He said he would do whatever it took to keep me off it." "Did he specifically mention violence?" "He implied it. The way a man implies it when he wants you to be afraid." "Did he say anything about burning the valley?" "I'm not sure of the exact words. He said something about not letting anyone take what was his." "I took it as a threat." The judge looked at Silas. "Mr. Greer, do you have any further evidence to present?" Hadley stood. "Your Honor, we have a witness who can speak to Mr. Collar's character. Mrs. Martha Henderson, who lives 3 miles south of the Greer Ranch." "Mrs. Henderson is here?" "She arrived this morning, Your Honor." "Call her." Martha Henderson walked to the stand, her face flushed from the cold. She was sworn in, and she sat down, her hands clasped in her lap. "Mrs. Henderson," the judge said, "what can you tell the court about Mr. Collar?" "I can tell you he's a man who has been trying to buy the Greer Ranch for 7 years. I can tell you he's offered to buy my land twice. I can tell you he doesn't take no kindly." "Have you ever known Mr. Greer to be a violent man?" "No, Your Honor. I've known him for 6 years. He's quiet. He keeps to himself. But he's never threatened anyone that I know of. When I brought him a pie last month, he thanked me and invited me in for coffee. That's not a violent man." The judge wrote something down. He looked at Collar. "Mr. Collar, is it true that you have attempted to purchase the Greer Ranch on multiple occasions?" "I've made offers. That's not a crime." "No, but it is a motive for bias. You have a financial interest in seeing Mr. Greer leave his property." "Your Honor, my concern is for the children. I live nearby. I see what goes on." "What do you see?" Collar hesitated. "I see a man who lives far from town. I see a woman who came out of nowhere. I see children who should be in school, not working on a ranch. Martha Henderson's testimony suggests that you have a history of aggressive business dealings, and Mr. Greer has provided witnesses who contradict your account of the alleged threat." Silas watched Collar's face. The man's composure was cracking, just slightly, a tightness around the eyes that had not been there a moment before. "Your Honor," Collar said, "I am telling the truth." The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked at the papers in front of him. "This court is not persuaded that the alleged threat occurred as described. The respondent has provided credible witnesses who contradict the petitioner's claim. The motion for emergency custody is denied." Collar's face went rigid. Harding's lawyer started to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "The full hearing on permanent guardianship remains scheduled for March 1st. The court expects both parties to be prepared. I will not entertain any further emergency motions unless there is clear and convincing evidence of imminent harm." He banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." Silas let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He looked at Samuel, who was still sitting in the witness box, his face calm. He looked at Martha Henderson, who gave him a small nod. He looked at Hadley, who was gathering his papers with a grim satisfaction. He walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon air, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself believe that they might actually win. They rode home through the fading light, Samuel silent beside him. The mare was tired, her head low, But she kept going, steady and sure. "She did good," Samuel said. "Who?" "Mrs. Henderson." She spoke up. "She did?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not afraid anymore." Silas looked at him. "Of what?" "Of losing this. I was afraid before." Every day, but not anymore. Silas did not know what to say. He reached over and put a hand on Samuel's shoulder, a brief touch, then pulled away. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a good silence, the kind that comes after a battle won. The house was lit when they arrived. The windows glowed yellow against the dark. Silas tied the mare to the gate and walked to the door. It opened before he reached it. Abigail stood in the doorway, Henry on her hip, Nell beside her. "Well," she said. "We won, for now." She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him. Henry pressed between them, and she held him tight. "Thank you," she whispered. He held her back. The hearing was in 4 days. They had won a battle, but the war was not over. But standing in the doorway of his house, surrounded by his family, Silas Greer felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt hope. The morning of March 1st arrived cold and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised nothing and everything. Silas stood on the porch before dawn, a cup of coffee warming his hands, and watched the stars fade one by one into the light. Behind him the house was stirring, Abigail's voice soft as she woke the children, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of bacon drifting through the open door. He had not slept. He had lain awake through the night, going over every word he would say, every question he might face, every possibility that could unfold. The weight of the day pressed down on him like the snow on the roof, heavy and constant. But beneath that weight there was something else, something that had grown slowly over the months since the broken wagon had rolled up his lane. It was not confidence. It was not certainty. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal to let fear make the decision for him. Samuel came out and stood beside him. The boy had the revolver tucked into his belt, hidden under his coat. Silas had told him not to bring it, but Samuel had insisted, and Silas had not argued. Some things a man had to carry for his own reasons. "Ready?" Samuel asked. "Ready as I'll ever be." They loaded the wagon in the gray light of early morning. The mare was rested and fed, her coat brushed until it shone. Abigail packed food for the journey, enough for 2 days, in case the hearing ran long. Nell carried her ledger under one arm and a small bag with her things under the other. Henry had the 2 wooden horses, one in each hand, and he would not let anyone hold them. They drove the long road to Grand Junction in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun rose behind them, casting their shadows long and thin across the snow. The world was quiet, the only sound the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of the mare's hooves. They arrived at the courthouse just before noon. Will Hadley was waiting for them on the steps, his coat buttoned tight against the wind, his face lined with the same exhaustion they all felt. "Harding arrived this morning with his lawyer and 3 witnesses," Hadley said. "Collar is among them. They've also brought a doctor from Denver who is prepared to testify that the children's isolation on the ranch constitutes a health risk." "A doctor who's never seen them," Abigail said. "That doesn't matter in a courtroom. It matters what he says, not what he knows." Silas looked at the courthouse. The building seemed larger today, more imposing. The windows were dark, reflecting the gray sky. He thought of Nell's ledger, of the hours she had spent writing down every detail of their lives. He thought of Samuel's quiet strength, of Henry's wooden horses, of Abigail's steady hands. "Let's go," he said. They filed into the courtroom. Judge Parker was already seated, his spectacles low on his nose, a stack of papers in front of him. The room was fuller than before. A few townspeople had come to watch, drawn by curiosity or sympathy. Harding sat at his table, his lawyer beside him. Collar sat behind them, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The judge called the court to order. He read the case number, the names of the parties, the purpose of the hearing. Then he looked up. "This is the final hearing on the petition for permanent guardianship filed by Mr. Thomas Harding. The court has heard preliminary arguments and has denied an emergency motion. Today, I will hear all remaining evidence and render a decision." He looked at Harding's lawyer. "You may present your case." The lawyer stood. He was a thin man with a sharp voice and a habit of pacing as he spoke. He called Harding to the stand first. Harding testified again, repeating the same claims he had made before: Abigail's instability, the lack of permanent residence, the isolation of the ranch. But this time he added new details. He spoke of the harsh winter, the difficulty of access, the absence of formal schooling. He spoke of his desire to provide a proper home for his brother's children, a home in Denver, with a school and a church and a doctor nearby. Hadley cross-examined with quiet precision. He asked Harding about the letters he had never written, about the funeral he had not attended, about the years he had let his brother's family struggle without offering help. Harding's answers grew shorter, his composure thinning. But he held his ground. The doctor from Denver testified next. He was a soft-faced man with a soothing voice. He spoke of the risks of isolation, the importance of access to medical care, the developmental harm that could come from a lack of social interaction. He had never met the children. He had never seen the ranch. But he spoke with the authority of someone who had read reports and formed opinions. Hadley rose to cross-examine. "Doctor, have you ever visited the Greer Ranch?" "No, I have not." "Have you ever examined the Harding children?" "No." "Have you spoken to anyone who has?" "I have spoken with Mr. Harding and his attorney." "So your testimony is based entirely on what you have been told by the man who is trying to take these children away from their mother?" The doctor flushed. "I am basing my opinion on general principles of child welfare and on the documented conditions of the property." "Documented by whom?" "By Mr. Collar's surveyor, by Mr. Harding's own observations. And those observations are, of course, unbiased." The doctor did not answer. The judge wrote something down. Collar was called next. He walked to the stand with the same easy confidence he had shown before, but there was something different in his eyes now, a wariness that had not been there at the emergency hearing. He had been caught in a lie once, and he knew that the judge would be watching. Collar testified about the isolation of the ranch, the harshness of the winters, the difficulty of access. He described the property as remote and dangerous for young children. He spoke of his concerns as a neighbor, a man who had lived in the valley for decades and knew what the land could do to the unprepared. Hadley asked him one question that changed everything. "Mr. Collar, you have made multiple offers to purchase the Greer Ranch over the past 7 years. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And those offers have been refused?" "Yes." "Would you describe yourself as a patient man, Mr. Collar?" "I am a persistent man." "Persistent enough to use a guardianship hearing as a means to acquire property?" Collar's face went rigid. "Objection," his lawyer said. "Sustained," Judge Parker said. "But the court will note the pattern." Silas watched Collar step down, his face dark, his hands clenched. The man had been exposed, not in a way that would convict him of anything, but in a way that made the truth of his motives clear. Harding's lawyer rested his case. Hadley stood. "Your Honor, the respondents call their first witness, Mrs. Abigail Greer." Abigail walked to the stand. She was calm, her shoulders straight, her eyes clear. She sat down and placed her hands on the rail. The judge asked her questions. She answered them with the same steady voice she had used on the first day Silas had met her. She spoke of her marriage to James, of his death, of the years of struggle that followed. She spoke of finding the notice in town, of driving the broken wagon up the lane, of the man who had taken her in without asking for anything in return. She spoke of the life they had built together, the meals, the lessons, the quiet evenings by the fire. She spoke of Henry's arm, and how Mr. Greer had set it, and how it had healed straight. "Do you believe your children are safe?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe they are safer than they have ever been." "Do you believe Mr. Greer is a good father to them?" "He is not their father by blood," Abigail said, "but he is their father in every way that matters." Silas felt something catch in his throat. He looked down at his hands. Hadley called Samuel next. The boy took the stand and answered the judge's questions with the same quiet directness he had shown before. He spoke of the work he did on the ranch, of the things Mr. Greer had taught him, of the way he felt when he was there. "I don't want to leave," Samuel said. "This is the first place I've felt like I belong since my father died." The judge nodded. He looked at Nell. "Miss Harding, would you like to testify?" Nell stood and walked to the stand. She carried her ledger, and she opened it without being asked. "Your Honor," she said, "I have kept a record of every day since we arrived at the Greer Ranch. I have written down what we ate, what we learned, what we did. I have written down the things Mr. Greer said and did. I have written down the way my mother laughed for the first time in 3 years." She held up the ledger. "If you want to know what our life is like, it's all in here." The judge took the ledger and read several pages in silence. The courtroom waited. The fire crackled. A clock ticked somewhere in the hallway. The judge closed the ledger and handed it back to Nell. "Thank you, young lady. That is a remarkable record." Nell took the ledger and returned to her seat without a word. Finally, Hadley called Silas. Silas walked to the stand and was sworn in. He sat down and looked at the judge, his hands resting on his knees. "Mr. Greer," the judge said, "you have heard the testimony of the petitioner and his witnesses. You have heard the testimony of your wife and children. Is there anything you wish to add?" Silas thought for a moment. He thought about the 6 years he had spent alone, the silence he had filled with work, the walls he had built around himself. He thought about the day the wagon arrived, the broken wheel, the 3 faces peering out from behind their mother. He thought about the first meal, the first biscuit, the first time Henry had shown him the wooden horse. "Your Honor," he said, "I am not a man who speaks easily. I have spent most of my life alone, and I thought that was the way I wanted it. But then a woman with 3 children showed up on my lane, and she needed help, and I needed help, and somewhere along the way, that help turned into something more." He paused. "I know what this looks like from the outside. A man who lived alone for years suddenly marries a widow. It looks convenient, but it is not convenient. It is the hardest thing I have ever done, and it is the best thing I have ever done." He looked at Abigail, at the children. "I love them, all of them, and I will do whatever I have to do to keep them safe." The room was silent. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then wrote something down. "Thank you, Mr. Greer. You may step down." Harding's lawyer rose for closing arguments. He spoke for 20 minutes, painting a picture of isolation and instability, of a marriage of convenience, of children at risk. Hadley rose in response. He spoke for 15 minutes, recounting the facts, the marriage certificate, the witnesses, the letters, the ledger. He spoke of a mother who had kept her children alive through 3 hard years, a man who had opened his home and his heart, a family that had been forged in the crucible of the frontier. The petitioner asks this court to take children away from a mother who loves them and place them with a man who has shown no interest in them until now. That is not guardianship. That is theft. The judge held up his hand. "I have heard enough." He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at Harding. He looked at Silas and Abigail. He looked at the children. This court has weighed the evidence carefully. The petitioner has failed to demonstrate that the children are in any danger in their current home. The respondents have shown that they have provided a stable, loving environment. The children have testified clearly that they wish to remain. He paused. The petition for permanent guardianship is denied. The children shall remain in the custody of their mother, Abigail Greer, and her husband, Silas Greer. The court finds no basis for continued oversight. This case is closed. The gavel banged. Abigail let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She turned and grabbed Silas's arms, her eyes wet. Nell was clutching her ledger to her chest, her face shining. Samuel sat frozen, then slowly let out a breath he had been holding for months. Henry did not understand what had happened, but he saw his mother crying and smiling, so he smiled too. Silas stood in the middle of the courtroom, surrounded by his family, and felt something break open inside him. He had spent 6 years building walls, and in one moment they all came down. Harding gathered his papers and left without a word. Collar followed, his face dark. They walked out of the courthouse and into the cold, and no one watched them go. The family rode home through the late afternoon, the sun warm despite the cold, the world golden and bright. Nell wrote in her ledger, recording the date, the verdict, the sound of the gavel. Samuel sat in the back, his hand resting on the revolver he had not needed to use. Henry held his horses and watched the mountains pass. When they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow. Silas lifted Abigail down from the wagon. He lifted Henry down. He stood in the yard and looked at the house, the roof he had repaired, the walls he had built, the windows that had been dark for so long and were now lit with warmth. They went inside. Abigail built a fire. Samuel brought in wood. Nell set her ledger on the table and opened it to a fresh page. Henry went to the windowsill and placed the two wooden horses side by side, their noses pointing out toward the darkening yard. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a third horse, small, rough-hewn, freshly carved. He set it beside the others. Silas stared at it. "Where did you get that?" "I made it," Henry said. "With your knife, when you were in the barn." Silas crouched down. He looked at the third horse, legs uneven, neck too short, head too big. It was the ugliest horse he had ever seen. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "It's a baby," Henry said, "for the baby horse, because now we have a whole family." Silas picked up the three horses, the worn mama from Henry's father, the rough baby he had carved himself, and now this tiny, lopsided foal that Henry had made in secret. He looked at the children, at Nell writing in her ledger, at Samuel standing by the fire, his eyes soft, at Abigail watching him from the kitchen doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. He looked back at the horses. "Yes," he said, "we do." And there they were. Three children who had arrived on a broken wagon, a woman who had driven them through the wilderness, a man who had forgotten how to need anyone and had learned it again. There they were, in a house that had been empty and was now full, in a life that had been silent and was now ringing with the sound of laughter and voices, and the clatter of dishes, and the creak of the floorboards under small running feet. That is the truth of the frontier. It is not a place of glory or quick justice. It is a place of hard ground and cold winters, and the slow, patient work of building something that will last. It is a place where a man can lose everything he thought he wanted and find what he actually needed. It is a place where a mother can show up at the end of her rope and find not a hand to turn her away, but a hand to pull her in. Silas Greer had burned a notice and told himself he needed no one. He had been wrong. And in being wrong, he had found everything. The horses stand on the windowsill to this day, 3 of them now, a family of wood and memory, looking out over the land that held them safe. And every night before he sleeps, Henry checks to make sure they are still there. And every morning, Silas looks at them before he walks out to the barn. They remind him that the finest thing a man can build is not a house or a fence or a fortune. It is a place where a child can set his horses on the windowsill and know that no one will make him take them down. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.